In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a cryptic letter whispers of a thief, cloaked in charm, preying on trust. Who was the shadowy Mr. Vane, whose smile disarms and eyes betray? Why are heirlooms vanishing, safes opening, and secrets spilling? Miss Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of deceit, but will she catch the trickster before he strikes again? One false step, and the village could lose everything. Chapter 1. The Whisper in St. Mary Mead. The late summer sun draped St. Mary Mead in a golden haze, its rays filtering through the ancient oaks that lined the village green. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the bay window, her knitting, needles clicking rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the distant hum of bees. The cottage smelled of lavender and fresh linen, and the world outside seemed as tranquil as ever. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes, peering over the rims of her spectacles, missed nothing, not the sparrow darting into the hedge, nor the faint unease that had begun to ripple through the village like a breeze stirring still water. It began with a letter, slipped through her door, just after dawn. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, with a hurried scrawl that suggested both urgency and caution. Miss Marple, never one to rush, had set it aside until her morning tea was brewed. Now, with a steaming cup of Earl Grey at her elbow, she slit the envelope open and unfolded the single sheet within. The message was brief, penned in ink that had smudged at the edges. Dear Miss Marple, you are known for seeing what others miss. A shadow moves in St. Mary Mead, cloaked in charm but hungry for gain. Trust not the smiles that dazzle, for they hide a thief. I dare not say more, but watch the newcomers. The village depends on you. Yours in haste, a friend. Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pursing slightly. Anonymous letters were not uncommon in her experience, often born of spite or mischief, but this one carried a weight of genuine fear. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her knitting basket, her mind already sifting through possibilities. A shadow, it said, a thief, and newcomers. St. Mary Mead was a small place, its rhythms predictable, its faces familiar. A newcomer would stand out like a fox in a henhouse. She rose, smoothing her lavender cardigan, and stepped into the garden. The roses were in full bloom, their scent mingling with the earthy tang of freshly turned soil. Her gardener, Tom, was weeding the beds, his cap pulled low against the sun. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, tipping his cap. "Fine day, isn't it?" "Quite fine, Tom," she replied, her voice gentle, but her eyes scanning the lane beyond. "Have you noticed any new faces about? Visitors, perhaps, or someone new to the village?" Tom scratched his chin, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Well, there's that Mr. Vane rented the old Grayson cottage last week. Smart fellow, dresses like he's stepped out of a London tailor's shop. Chatted with him at the pub full of stories. He is. Said he's here for the quiet, but he's been poking about, asking questions. Questions?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest sharpened. "Oh, you know, about who owns what land, who's got money tucked away. Said he's thinking of investing in the area. Seemed harmless enough, but—" Tom hesitated, then shrugged. "He's got a way of making you talk more than you mean to." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. "Thank you, Tom. Keep weeding, won't you? Those roses deserve your care." She returned to the cottage, her mind turning over Tom's words. Mr. Vane. a name to remember. The village had seen its share of charming strangers, and Miss Marple knew charm could be a mask as easily as a mirror. She decided to observe this. Mr. Vane herself, and the perfect opportunity was at hand. The annual tea gathering at the vicarage, set for that afternoon. Everyone who was anyone in St. Mary Mead would be there, sipping tea and exchanging gossip. If a shadow was moving, it would surely cast itself across such a gathering dot by 2 o'clock. The vicarage lawn was a tableau of village life. Trestle. Tables groaned under plates of scones, cucumber sandwiches, and Victoria sponge, their edges dusted with icing sugar like snow. Children darted between the adults, giggling as they chased a stray kitten, while the vicar, Mr. Clement, circulated. With a benevolent smile, Miss Marple, in her best silk dress and a hat adorned with a single rose, settled into a wicker chair beneath a willow tree, her knitting in her lap. From this vantage point, she could see the entire gathering, her eyes darting from face to face, cataloguing every glance, every gesture. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was whispering to Mrs. Hartnell about a recent delivery of expensive wine to the manor. Colonel Bantry, red-faced and jovial, was regaling a group with tales of his army days, while his wife, Dolly, rolled her eyes fondly. The younger set, Miss Weatherby and her cousins, flirted shamelessly with the vicar's nephew, who blushed under their attention. And then there was Mr. Clarence Vane. He stood near the tea-table, a tall man in his early 40s, with dark hair swept back and a suit of impeccable cut. His smile was warm, his movements graceful, and he seemed to draw people to him like moths to a lantern. Miss Marple watched as he charmed Mrs. Weatherby, the wealthiest widow in the village, with a story about his travels in Florence. His voice carried just enough to reach her ears, rich with the cadence of a born storyteller. And there I was, he said, his eyes twinkling, standing in the Piazza della Signoria, when a pickpocket tried his luck. I caught his wrist, mind. You, and he dropped the wallet belonged to an American heiress, no less. She was so grateful, she invited me to her villa for dinner. Mrs. Weatherby laughed, her hand fluttering to her pearl necklace. Oh, Mr. Vane, you do lead an exciting life, and now you've settled in our little village. Whatever brought you here? The peace, he said, his tone earnest. After years of travel, I wanted a place where people know each other, where trust still means something. St. Mary Mead feels like home already. Miss Marple's needles paused. Trust still means something. The words echoed the letters. Warning, and she filed them away. Mr. Vane moved on, engaging Colonel Bantry in a discussion about rare coins, then complimenting Miss Weatherby on her hat. He was everywhere, yet nowhere, slipping through the crowd with the ease of a fish through water. But Miss Marple noticed something others missed. His eyes. They were never still, always scanning, assessing, calculating as the afternoon wore. On the air grew thick with heat, and the guests began to drift toward the shade. Miss Marple, however, remained alert, her attention drawn to a small commotion near the vicarage gate. Mrs. Harton, her face flushed with indignation, was speaking loudly to the vicar. It's outrageous, Mr. Clement. I entrusted my late husband's watch to that jeweler in Much Benham, and now he claims it's been misplaced. A family heirloom gone. The vicar murmured soothingly, but Miss Marple's ears pricked. She knew the jeweler in Much Benham a reputable man, not prone to carelessness. She glanced at Mr. Vane, who was nearby, offering Mrs. Hartnell a handkerchief with a look of concern. "How dreadful, Mrs. Hartnell," he said. "Perhaps I could help? I know a chap in London who specializes in recovering lost items." Mrs. Hartnell, mollified, accepted the handkerchief. "That's kind of you, Mr. Vane, I'll let you know." Miss Marple's needles resumed their dance. A lost heirloom, a charming stranger offering help. It was a pattern she'd seen before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond. People like Mr. Vane thrived on trust, weaving it into a net to catch the unwary. She decided to test her suspicions. Approaching the tea-table, she feigned a stumble, her knitting spilling from her basket. Mr. Vane was at her side in an instant, his hand steadying her elbow. "Careful, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quavering slightly, playing the frail spinster. "Oh, how clumsy of me." "Thank you, young man." "My pleasure," he said, his smile dazzling. "Clarence Vane, at your service. I don't believe we've met." "No, indeed," she said, her eyes meeting his for a moment. They were blue, sharp, and utterly unreadable. "You're new to St. Mary Mead, I hear. A traveler, perhaps?" "Something like that," he replied, gathering her knitting. "I've been all over Paris, Rome, Cairo, but there's something special about this village. The people are so open." "Open," she echoed, nodding. "Yes, we do pride ourselves on our hospitality. But one must be careful, Mr. Vane. Not everyone is as they seem." His smile didn't falter, but she caught the briefest flicker in his eyes, a spark of wariness. "Wise words, Miss Marple. I'll keep them in mind." They parted, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, her heart beating a little faster. She had seen enough to confirm the letter's warning. Mr. Vane was no ordinary newcomer. His charm was a tool honed to perfection, and his interest in the village's wealth was too keen for innocence. But she needed more than intuition. She needed evidence. The tea gathering wound down, the guests dispersing as the sun dipped low. Miss Marple lingered, chatting with Dolly Bantry about the rose show, but her mind was elsewhere. She recalled a conversation from weeks ago when Mrs. Price had mentioned an influx of letters from London, some addressed to prominent villagers. Could they be connected to Vane? She resolved to visit the post office the next day. As she walked home, the village seemed to hum with secrets. The butcher's boy whistled a tune, the church bells chimed evensong, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. But beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, like a thread pulled loose from a tapestry. She thought of her nephew, Raymond, who often teased her about her village parallels, her habit of seeing the world's evils reflected in St. Mary Mead's small dramas. A charming stranger, a lost heirloom, a whispered warning. It was a pattern, and patterns, to Miss Marple, were the key to everything. That evening, she sat by her fire, the anonymous letter in hand. She studied the handwriting again, noting the slant, the smudged ink. It was written in haste, but with care, as if the writer feared discovery. She considered the villagers Mrs. Hartnell, quick to complain, Mrs. Weatherby, vulnerable in her wealth, Colonel Bantry trusting to a fault. Any of them could be the friend, but none seemed likely. The letter felt external, a voice from beyond the village's borders. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Lucy, the vicar's maid, her face pale in the lamplight. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mr. Clement sent me. There's been a bit of trouble." "Trouble?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her pulse quickened. Do come in, Lucy, and tell me." Lucy hesitated, then stepped inside, clutching her shawl. "It's Mrs. Weatherby, ma'am. She was at the tea. You saw her all happy with Mr. Vane. Well, she went home and found her safe open, not forced. Mind, just open. Nothing's missing, she says, but she's in a state, thinking someone's been in her house." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And did she mention Mr. Vane?" Lucy nodded. "She said he walked her home, all gentlemanlike, but he didn't go in. She's sure of that. Still, she's frightened, and Mr. Clement thought you might— Well, you know how you are, ma'am." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Lucy. Tell Mr. Clement I'll call on Mrs. Weatherby tomorrow. And do be careful walking back, it's dark out." As Lucy left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting forgotten. An open safe, nothing taken, and Mr. Vane conveniently nearby. It was bold, almost theatrical, as if he wanted to be noticed, or perhaps he was testing the village's vigilance. Either way, it was a move, and Miss Marple was ready to counter it. The next morning, she dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a blouse with a cameo brooch, Mrs. Weatherby's. Manor was a short walk, its ivy-covered walls looming over the lane. The widow greeted her with nervous energy, her hands fluttering as she poured tea. "I don't know what to think, Jane," Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice trembling. "The safe was locked when I left for the tea, I'm certain. And yet, there, it was wide open, as if by magic." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the room. The safe, a sturdy iron box, sat in the corner, its door indeed unforced. "Tell me, Eleanor, did anyone know the combination?" "A servant, perhaps, or—" "A friend?" "No one," Mrs. Weatherby insisted. "Only me. I change it every month, you know, ever since poor George passed. I wrote it down this time in my diary, but that's locked in my desk." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the desk, a mahogany piece with a brass lock. "May I see the diary?" "Mrs." Weatherby hesitated, then fetched it, unlocking the drawer with a small key. The diary was leather-bound, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Miss Marple turned to the latest entry, where a series of numbers was jotted in the margin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. She closed the diary, her expression unchanged. "You mentioned Mr. Vane walked you home," she said casually. "Did he linger at all? Admire the house, perhaps?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "Well, yes, he did. He said the manor reminded him of a place in Tuscany, all that ivy. He was so kind, carrying my shawl. But he didn't come inside, Jane, I swear. Of course," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've had a shock, Eleanor. Why don't you rest, and I'll have a word with the vicar about extra patrols." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, relieved, and Miss Marple took her leave. As she walked back, she pieced together the puzzle. The safe's combination, written in a diary, and a charming stranger who'd been close enough to glimpse it, perhaps while helping. With a shawl, it was clever, but not clever enough. She recalled a maid in her youth, a girl who'd been charmed by a traveling salesman into revealing her mistress's secrets. People, Miss Marple thought, never changed dot at the post office. Mrs. Price was sorting letters, her spectacles perched on her nose. "Good morning, Jane," she said. "What brings you here? Not another mystery, I hope?" "Just curiosity," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "I hear we've had some interesting mail from London lately." "Anything for Mr. Vane, perhaps? Mrs. Price's eyes lit up with a thrill of gossip. Funny you should ask. He's had 3 letters this week, all from the same address in Mayfair. Thick envelopes, too, not your usual bills. I couldn't help but notice, you know how it is. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Mayfair was a world away from St. Mary Mead, a place of wealth and intrigue. She thanked Mrs. Price and stepped outside, where the village green was coming to life. Children played by the pond, and the butcher's cart rattled past. But Miss Marple's thoughts were on Mr. Vane, his Mayfair letters, and the open safe. That evening she wrote a letter of her own to an old friend in London, a retired inspector with contacts in Mayfair. She asked for discretion, mentioning only a new acquaintance in the village. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The first move had been made, the first clue uncovered. Mr. Vane was a puzzle, but puzzles were her specialty. She placed the anonymous letter in her desk drawer, locked it, and went to bed, her mind already anticipating the next day's discoveries. St. Mary Mead slept under a blanket of stars, its secrets tucked away in the shadows. But Miss Marple knew those shadows held answers, and she was determined to find them. For now she had thwarted a small danger. Mrs. Weatherby's safe was secure, and the village was none the wiser. But the game was only beginning, and Miss Marple was ready to play. Chapter 2. The Mask of Charm. The church hall of St. Mary Mead buzzed with a gentle hum of anticipation, a symphony of clinking teacups, rustling petticoats, and the low murmur of polite conversation. The annual fundraiser for the village's orphanage was in full swing, its air thick with the scent of freshly baked scones and the faint tang of lavender from the sachets tucked into the tablecloths. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her eyes sharp as they darted over the crowd. To the untrained observer she was merely a silver-haired spinster, her prim cardigan and sensible shoes blending seamlessly into the backdrop of village life. But to those who knew her, those keen eyes missed nothing, and her mind was already piecing together the subtle threads of a mystery that had begun with a cryptic letter only days before. The letter, slipped under her cottage door in the dead of night, had been brief but pointed. Beware the charming stranger. He seeks what is not his. Unsigned, written in a hurried scrawl, it had piqued her curiosity. At the tea gathering 2 days prior, she had spotted him, Mr. Clarence Vane, the newcomer whose arrival had set tongues wagging. His tailored suit, his easy smile, and the way he seemed to know just what to say to each villager had marked him as someone worth watching. Now, at the fundraiser, he was the center of attention, moving through the crowd like a dancer, his words as smooth as the polished oak floor beneath their feet. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Vane Lane close to Mrs. Eleanor Price, a widow of considerable means whose late husband's fortune was the talk of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Price, her cheeks flushed, was hanging on Vane's every word, her laughter a touch too bright. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She knew the signs of a predator circling charm was a mask, and Vane wore it well. "Miss Marple, you're awfully quiet today," said Dolly Bantry, plopping down beside her with a plate of cucumber sandwiches. Dolly, with her boisterous laugh and penchant for gossip, was one of Miss Marple's closest allies in the village. "Not scheming, are you?" "Oh, Dolly, you know I'm far too old for scheming," Miss Marple replied, her voice light but her eyes never leaving Vane. "I'm merely observing." Mr. Vane seems to have quite the gift for conversation." Dolly followed her gaze, her brows knitting. "He's certainly got the village eating out of his hand. Did you hear? He's pledged £500 to the orphanage. 500, can you imagine?" "Generous indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Though generosity can sometimes be a costume, don't you think?" Dolly's eyes widened, but before she could press further, a hush fell over the room. Mr. Vane had climbed onto the small stage at the front of the hall, his hands raised for attention. The crowd turned, their faces alight with curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vane began, his voice rich and warm, like honey over toast. "I stand before you a stranger in your charming village, humbled by your warmth and generosity. Today, I wish to contribute to your noble cause. In addition to my earlier pledge, I offer a matching donation. Every pound you raise today, I shall match up to £1,000. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by enthusiastic applause. Mrs. Price clapped so vigorously, her pearl bracelet nearly slipped off. Miss Marple's needles stilled again, her mind racing. £1,000 was no small sum, even for a man of Vane's apparent means. Such a gesture was bold, calculated, and, she suspected, not entirely altruistic as the crowd surged forward. To congratulate Vane, Miss Marple slipped her knitting into her bag and rose, her movements deliberate. She approached the refreshment table, where Mrs. Price was now pouring tea for Vane, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. "Mr. Vane," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "that was a most generous offer. You must have a great fondness for charitable causes." Vane turned, his smile as polished as his cufflinks. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I've heard you're the heart of this village. And yes, I believe in giving back. A man's wealth is only as good as the good it does." "Quite so," she replied, her eyes meeting his. There was a flicker in his gaze, a momentary tightening, as if he sensed her scrutiny. "Though I wonder, Mr. Vane, what brings a man of your sophistication to a quiet place like St. Mary Mead?" "Oh, the simple life, Miss Marple," he said, his laugh easy. "I've spent years in London chasing deals and dodging traffic. I wanted peace, and your village is a slice of paradise." "Paradise, indeed," she said, smiling faintly. "Though even paradise has its serpents, doesn't it?" His laugh faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "You're a poet, Miss Marple. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must speak with Mrs. Price about her donation." As he moved away, Miss Marple's smile faded. She had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. Clarence Vane was no mere philanthropist. His charm was a tool, wielded with precision, and Mrs. Price was his latest target. The afternoon wore on, the fundraiser growing livelier as villagers, emboldened by Vane's pledge, opened their purses. Miss Marple, however, kept her distance, her eyes tracking Vane's every move. She noticed how he lingered with the wealthier residents, his compliments tailored to each praising Mr. Thompson's prize roses, admiring Mrs. Grayson's antique brooch, and listening intently as Mrs. Price recounted her late husband's investments in railway stocks. It was a performance, and a masterful one. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered enough to act. She found Mrs. Price near the coat rack, her face flushed with excitement as she clutched a small envelope. Miss Marple recognized it at once, a promissory note, the kind used for private investments. "Mrs. Price, a word?" Miss Marple said, her tone soft but urgent. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it wonderful?" Mrs. Price gushed. "Mr. Vane has offered me a chance to invest in his new venture, a shipping company, he says, with guaranteed returns. He's so kind, taking an interest in a widow like me." Miss Marple's heart sank, but her face remained serene. "How thoughtful of him. Might I see the note, dear? My nephew Raymond dabbles in investments, and I've picked up a thing or two." Mrs. Price hesitated, then handed over the envelope. Miss Marple opened it, her eyes scanning the document. The language was florid, promising a 20% return within 6 months, but the details were vague. No specific company name, no address, only Vane's signature scrawled at the bottom. It was a classic confidence trick, dressed up in fine paper. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, folding the note, "did Mr. Vane mention where this shipping company is based?" "Well, no," Mrs. Price admitted, her brow furrowing. "He said it was a new venture, very exclusive. But he's so trustworthy, don't you think?" "Trust is a precious thing," Miss Marple said carefully. "But I wonder, have you considered asking Mr. Vane for references? My nephew always insists on speaking to other investors before committing." Mrs. Price blinked, uncertainty creeping into her eyes. "References? I hadn't thought. But surely, with his donation today, generosity is admirable." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But business is another matter. Perhaps you might wait a day or two, just to be certain." Mrs. Price nodded slowly, her enthusiasm dimming. "You're right, Miss Marple. I'll think it over." Miss Marple returned the note, her heart lighter. She had planted a seed of doubt, and for now it was enough. As Mrs. Price slipped the envelope back into her purse, Miss Marple caught Vane watching them from across the room. His smile was still in place, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. She met his gaze, her own expression one of serene innocence, and he looked away. The fundraiser ended with a flourish, the vicar announcing that, thanks to Vane's matching pledge, they had raised nearly £2,000. The crowd cheered, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She had saved Mrs. Price from a costly mistake, but Vane's scheme was far from over. His grand gesture today, she suspected, was merely the opening act of a larger performance. As the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, helping the vicar's wife clear the tables. She overheard snippets of conversation praise for Vane's generosity, speculation about his wealth, and a few whispers of envy. But one comment from old Mr. Thompson caught her ear. "Mark my words," he muttered to his wife, "that Vane fellow's too good to be true. I saw him slip something to that young man by the door, looked like a letter, and not a friendly one." Miss Marple's ears pricked. She glanced at the door, but the young man was gone. Filing the detail away, she finished stacking plates and bid the vicar's wife good night. Outside, the evening air was cool, the village bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Miss Marple walked home, her steps measured, her mind alight with possibilities. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She opened her notebook, its pages already filled with observations about Vane, his mannerisms, his targets, his too-perfect backstory. Tonight she added a new entry: letter passed to unknown young man at fundraiser. Possible accomplice? She closed the notebook, her lips curving into a satisfied smile. Clarence Vane was a clever man, but cleverness could be a weakness when matched against patience and perception. She had thwarted his first move, saving Mrs. Price's savings, but she knew his plans were grander, his ambition sharper. The game was just beginning, and Miss Marple was ready to play. The next morning, St. Mary Mead woke to a fresh rumor. Mr. Vane had invited the village's elite to a private dinner at his rented manor, promising an opportunity too good, too. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt a familiar thrill. The mask of charm was firmly in place, but she was already peering beneath it, ready to unravel the next thread of Clarence Vane's wily scheme. Chapter 3. The Stolen Heirloom. The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the gravel path to Harrington Manor. The grand old house, with its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows, stood as a testament to the village's storied past, its stone facade glowing warmly in the fading light. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Lady Margaret Harrington, a widow of impeccable grace and formidable presence, paced the drawing-room, her silk gown rustling with each agitated step. Her prized sapphire brooch, an heirloom, passed down through 5 generations of Harringtons, had vanished during last night's intimate dinner party. The theft had sent ripples of unease through the household, and Miss Jane Marple, ever the keen observer, was determined to untangle the mystery. Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she listened to Lady Harrington recount the evening's events. The room was a study in elegance, polished mahogany furniture, a crystal chandelier catching the light, and a portrait of the late Lord Harrington gazing sternly from above the mantel. A small gathering of villagers and a few invited guests, including the charming newcomer Mr. Clarence Vane, had attended the dinner. The brooch, Lady Harrington explained, had been pinned to her velvet shawl, which she'd worn throughout the meal. She'd noticed its absence only when retiring to her room after the guests had departed. "It's not just the value, Jane," Lady Harrington said, her voice trembling with indignation. "That brooch was my grandmother's and her grandmother's. Before her, it's irreplaceable. To think someone in my own home—" She broke off, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and bright behind her spectacles, soft with sympathy. "My dear Margaret, it's a dreadful shock, but we shall get to the bottom of it. Tell me, who was present last night?" Lady Harrington listed the guests: the vicar, Mr. Clement, and his wife, Dr. Haydock, the village physician, Mrs. Price, the postmistress with a penchant for gossip, and Mr. Clarence Vane, whose arrival in St. Mary Mead had coincided with a series of unsettling incidents. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly at the mention of Vane's name, but she said nothing, merely nodding for Lady Harrington to continue. "I can't imagine any of them stooping to theft," Lady Harrington said, sinking onto a settee. "But Clarence Vane, there's something about him. Too smooth, too eager to please. And he was so curious about the brooch, asking its history during dinner. I thought it polite interest at the time, but now—" She trailed off, her brow furrowing. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already sifting through possibilities. She'd observed Vane at the dinner, his tailored suit and easy smile drawing attention like a magnet. His questions about the brooch had indeed been pointed, but cleverly disguised as admiration. She recalled the way his eyes had lingered on the sapphire, glinting under the candlelight, and how he'd maneuvered to sit near Lady Harrington, engaging her in animated conversation. "Let's not leap to conclusions," Miss Marple said gently, "but I'd like to see the room where you last wore the shawl, if I may." Lady Harrington led her upstairs to the bedroom, a spacious chamber adorned with floral wallpaper and heavy drapes. The velvet shawl lay draped over a chaise longue, its folds undisturbed since the previous night. Miss Marple examined it closely, her fingers brushing the fabric where the brooch had been pinned. No tear, no loose threads, nothing to suggest it had been forcibly removed. She glanced around the room, noting the open window, the faint scent of lavender from the garden below, and the polished floorboards that bore no obvious scuffs or marks. "Was the window open during the evening?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, it was warm, and I wanted a breeze," Lady Harrington replied. "But surely no one climbed in. The window's 2 stories up, and there's no trellis or ivy on this side." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a small writing desk in the corner, a silver inkstand, a few letters, and a delicate lace. Doily caught her eye. She approached the desk, her movements unhurried, and bent slightly to inspect the floor. There, tucked beneath the desk's claw-footed leg, was a scrap of fabric, a monogrammed handkerchief, its corner embroidered with the initials C.V. in elegant script. She retrieved it with care, holding it up to the light. "Margaret, do you recognize this?" Lady Harrington's eyes widened. "That's not mine. And those initials, Clarence Vane?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "It may have fallen from someone's pocket, or been left deliberately." She folded the handkerchief and slipped it into her reticule, her mind racing. Vane's presence at the dinner, his interest in the brooch, and now this handkerchief, it was too neat, too convenient. A clever man like Vane wouldn't leave such an obvious clue unless he meant to. Returning downstairs, Miss Marple requested to speak with the household staff. The butler, Mr. Grayson, a stooped man with a meticulous demeanor, confirmed that all doors were locked after the guests left, and no one had reported seeing an intruder. The maid, Elsie, a nervous girl with wide eyes, mentioned that Mr. Vane had lingered in the hall after dinner, claiming to admire a painting. "He was ever so polite," Elsie said, twisting her apron. Asked about the manor's history, said, "He'd love to see more of it some day." "Did he go near the staircase?" Miss Marple asked. Elsie hesitated. "I don't think so, ma'am. He was in the hall when I went to clear the table, but I didn't watch him every moment." Miss Marple thanked her and turned her attention to the dining room, where the dinner had taken place. The long oak table was still set with the remnants of last night's meal, crystal glasses glinting in the sunlight. She paced the room, her eyes scanning the carpet, the chairs, the sideboard. Near the window, she noticed a faint smudge on the sill, a trace of mud, barely visible. It was fresh, not yet dried, suggesting someone had been there recently, perhaps during the night. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the front door. Mr. Grayson admitted Dr. Haydock, who had come to check on Lady Harrington's nerves. The doctor, a jovial man with a booming voice, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Heard about the theft, Jane. Nasty business. Any theories?" "Only observations so far," Miss Marple replied, her smile enigmatic. "But I wonder, Doctor, did you notice anything odd about Mr. Vane last night?" He seemed quite taken with Lady Harrington's brooch. Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin. Now that you mention it, he did ask about its value. Said he'd seen similar pieces in London. I thought it a bit forward, but he passed it off as curiosity. You think he's involved? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that people reveal themselves in small ways. A question here, a glance there. It adds up. After the doctor left, Miss Marple returned to the village, her mind buzzing. The handkerchief was a puzzle. If Vane had taken the brooch, why leave such a blatant clue? Was he careless, or was this a misdirection? She recalled a similar incident. Years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a young man had planted false evidence to divert suspicion from his true crime. Vane, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, clever, calculating, and fond of theatrics. That evening, Miss Marple attended a village meeting at the church hall, where Mr. Vane was speaking about his proposed charity auction. The room was packed, villagers buzzing with excitement over his promises of prosperity. Vane stood at the podium, his voice smooth as silk, his gestures practiced. St. Mary Mead deserves to shine, he declared, and I'm here to help it do so. Miss Marple sat near the back, her knitting untouched in her lap. She watched Vane's every move, noting how he scanned the crowd, locking eyes with the wealthier residents. His charm was a weapon, wielded with precision. During a break, she approached him, her demeanor mild, but her eyes sharp. "Mr. Vane," she said, "I understand you're quite the connoisseur of fine things. Lady Harrington's brooch, for instance, such a lovely piece." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes flickered. "A beautiful heirloom," he agreed. "A shame it's gone missing. I hope it's found soon." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "It's curious how things disappear under one's nose, but they often turn up in unexpected places." Vane's expression remained genial, but she sensed a wariness in him. She excused herself and slipped out, determined to investigate further. Back at her cottage, she spread the handkerchief on her table, examining it under a magnifying glass. The stitching was fine, the fabric expensive, too fine for a man who claimed modest means. She tucked it away and penned a letter to an old friend, Inspector Craddock, requesting discreet inquiries about Vane's background. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the manor again, this time with a plan. She asked Lady Harrington to gather the dinner guests for a casual tea, framing it as a way to ease tensions after the theft. The vicar and his wife arrived first, followed by Mrs. Price, whose eyes gleamed with the prospect of gossip. Dr. Haydock bustled in, apologizing for his tardiness, and finally Mr. Vane appeared, his smile as polished as ever. As they sipped tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the dinner party, encouraging each guest to recount their movements. The vicar had been discussing sermons with Lady Harrington. Mrs. Price had been admiring the silverware. Dr. Haydock had stepped out for a cigarette. Vane claimed he'd been in the dining room the entire time, chatting with Elsie about the manor's art collection. Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign. "It's strange," she said, "how a brooch can vanish in a room full of people, almost as if it were spirited away." She paused, her gaze settling on Vane, or perhaps it never left the house. The room grew quiet. Lady Harrington frowned. "What do you mean, Jane?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "that sometimes things are hidden in plain sight. Margaret, have you checked the folds of your shawl thoroughly? Or perhaps the lining of a certain guest's coat?" Vane's smile tightened. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting—" "Not suggesting," she said mildly, "merely wondering. For instance, I found this near your desk, Margaret." She produced the handkerchief, holding it up for all to see. "It's quite distinctive with the initial CV, a curious coincidence, wouldn't you say?" The vicar coughed, Mrs. Price gasped, and Dr. Haydock leaned forward, intrigued. Vane's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered. Quickly, "I must have dropped it," he said. "I was in the hall, as Elsie said." "It means nothing." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But let's test a theory. Margaret, would you mind if we checked the dining room again? I have a hunch." Lady Harrington agreed, and the group moved to the dining room. Miss Marple directed their attention to the sideboard, where a silver candelabrum stood. "This was near your seat, Margaret, wasn't it? And Mr. Vane, you were seated just there." She pointed to a chair beside the sideboard. "If I were a brooch and I'd fallen from a shawl, I might roll just so." She knelt, her movements surprisingly agile for her age, and peered beneath the sideboard. Her fingers brushed the carpet, and with a small exclamation she drew out the sapphire brooch, its gem catching the light like a tiny star dot. Lady Harrington gasped. "Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple straightened, handing the brooch to her friend. "It occurred to me that a brooch might not be stolen at all, but misplaced deliberately or otherwise. A clever person might hide it to create a distraction, or to retrieve it later when suspicion had passed." Vane's face was a mask of polite surprise, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Remarkable," he said. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple." She smiled, her expression serene. "I merely observe it, Mr. Vane. Things have a way of revealing themselves." The tea concluded with Lady Harrington's relief palpable, the brooch safely returned to her possession. As the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered, watching Vane's retreating figure. The handkerchief, the mud on the sill, his lingering in the hall, it all pointed to him. Yet the brooches? Recovery felt too easy. She suspected Vane had intended to retrieve it later, perhaps during another visit, to sell it discreetly. Or perhaps the theft was a feint, a way to test the village's vigilance while he planned something larger. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap. The village lay quiet under the stars, but her mind was far from still. Vane was a wily trickster, and this was merely a skirmish in a larger game. She'd thwarted him this time, but his next move would be bolder, more dangerous. She smiled faintly, her needles clicking once more. Let him try, she thought. St. Mary Mead had her, and she was ready. Chapter 4. The False Benefactor. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen across the village green, where preparations for the annual summer fete were in full swing. Bunting fluttered from lamp-posts, and the air carried the scent of freshly baked scones and lavender from Mrs. Price's flower stall. Amid the cheerful bustle, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a bench near the church, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, her eyes sharp as they scanned the crowd. She wasn't here for the lemonade or the tombola, though she'd bought a ticket to keep up appearances. Her attention was fixed on one man, Mr. Clarence Vane, the village's newest and most charismatic resident. Vane stood at the center of a small knot of villagers, his tailored suit pristine despite the heat, his smile as polished as the silver watch chain glinting at his waist. He was regaling Mrs. Bantry and Colonel Melchett with the tale of his supposed travels in the Orient, his voice carrying just enough charm to mask its calculated cadence. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had been watching Vane for weeks, ever since that cryptic letter arrived at her cottage, hinting at a swindler in their midst. His generosity at the church fundraiser last week had raised eyebrows, but today's announcement had set the village abuzz. Mr. Vane was organizing a charity auction to benefit the St. Mary Mead orphanage, a cause no one could fault. The village was eating out of his hand. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that altruism often cloaked ambition, and Vane's benevolence felt too deliberate, too staged. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers pausing mid-stitch as she overheard Mrs. Bantry exclaim, "Oh, Mr. Vane, you're simply too good to be true." An auction, and all for those dear children. "Merely doing my part, Mrs. Bantry," Vane replied, his voice smooth as honey. "A man of means must give back, mustn't he?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A man of means, she thought. But where did those means come from? She had already begun her quiet inquiries, leveraging her network of old friends and distant cousins who had a knack for digging up secrets. Vane's backstory was a tapestry of half-truths born in Bristol. Educated in London, a vague mention of investments abroad, but nothing concrete, nothing verifiable. Today she would take a closer step toward unraveling him. Rising from the bench, she tucked her knitting into her straw bag and ambled toward the church hall, where Vane was holding court over a table laden with donated items for the auction. A silver tea set from Lady Harrington, a set of leather-bound Dickens novels from the vicar, even a rather garish oil painting from Mrs. Price's late husband. The crowd was enchanted, and Vane played the role of benefactor with aplomb, gesturing grandly as he described each item's provenance. "Miss Marple," he called, spotting her approach. His smile was warm, but his eyes held a flicker of wariness. "Will you be contributing to our little auction? I'm sure you have treasures tucked away in that charming cottage of yours." "Oh, I'm far too sentimental to part with my trinkets, Mr. Vane," she replied, her tone light but her gaze steady. "But I'll be bidding, of course, for the children." "Splendid," he said, clapping his hands. "We'll make a grand day of it, won't we?" As the crowd murmured their approval, Miss Marple drifted closer to the table, her eyes lingering on a small, ornate jewelry box donated by Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. It was a pretty thing, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, but what caught her attention was the way Vane's hand hovered over it, his fingers brushing the lid as if assessing its weight. She filed the observation away, her mind already turning over possibilities. The fete continued, with children darting through the crowd and the village band striking up a jaunty tune. Miss Marple made her rounds, chatting with neighbors, her ears attuned to any mention of Vane. Mrs. Bantry, ever the gossip, was only too happy to share her thoughts over a cup of tea. "He's such a gentleman," she said, fanning herself with a program. "Did you know he's promised to match every pound raised at the auction? Why, we might rebuild the orphanage entirely." "Very generous," Miss Marple murmured, sipping her tea. "Though I wonder where such funds come from." "Investments, I suppose." "Oh, I'm sure," Mrs. Bantry said vaguely. "He mentioned something about railways in India." Or was it South Africa, anyway? He's a godsend. Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere. Railways in India, indeed. She had written to her old friend, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, who had lived in Bombay for years and knew everyone worth knowing in colonial circles. If Vane had any connection to Indian railways, Mrs. McGillicuddy would know or know someone who did by late afternoon. The fete was winding down, and Miss Marple slipped into the church hall to inspect the auction items more closely. The room was quiet, save for the soft creak of floorboards and the distant laughter from the green. She approached the jewelry box, her gloved fingers tracing its edges. It was locked, but the keyhole was scratched, as if someone had tampered with it. Curious, she thought. Mrs. Clement had described it as a family heirloom, yet it bore signs of rough handling. A shadow fell across the table, and Miss Marple turned to find Vane standing in the doorway, his smile as fixed as ever. "Admiring the donations, Miss Marple?" he asked, stepping closer. "Merely appreciating Mrs. Clement's taste," she replied, her voice mild. "This box is quite lovely, though it seems to have had an adventure or two." Vane's smile tightened. "Oh, these old things often do. Bumps and scratches add character, don't you think?" "Indeed," she said, meeting his gaze. "Though I find it's the stories behind such marks that reveal the most." For a moment neither spoke, the air between them taut with unspoken challenge. Then Vane chuckled, breaking the tension. "You have a poet's soul, Miss Marple. Now, if you'll— Excuse me, I must see to the auction preparations." As he left, Miss Marple's eyes followed him, her mind racing. The jewelry box was a small matter, but it was a thread to tug, and she had always been good at unraveling knots. The auction was set for Saturday, and St. Mary Mead buzzed with anticipation. The village hall was transformed, with rows of chairs, facing a makeshift stage where Vane would serve as auctioneer. Miss Marple arrived early, taking a seat near the back, her knitting in her lap as a prop to deflect attention. She watched as villagers filed in, their faces alight with excitement. Vane had worked his magic well. Even the skeptical Colonel Melchett was whispering to his wife about bidding on the Dickens novels. The auction began with a flourish, Vane's voice commanding the room as he presented each item with a story, some plausible, others suspiciously grandiose. The silver tea set fetched a handsome sum, and the oil painting, to everyone's surprise, sparked a bidding war between Mrs. Price and Mr. Hayworth, the local butcher. Miss Marple noted how Vane's eyes gleamed as the bids climbed, his gestures growing more animated. When the jewelry box came up, Miss Marple sat straighter, her needles still. "A charming piece," Vane said, holding it aloft. "From the esteemed Clement family, a treasure with a history of love and loss. Shall we start at £10? The bidding was brisk, with Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock vying for it. Miss Marple raised her hand, offering £15, her voice calm but clear. Vane's eyes flicked to her, a faint crease forming on his brow. "15 from Miss Marple," he said. "Do I hear 20? The room went quiet for a moment, and then Mrs. Bantry bid 20. Miss Marple countered with 25, her expression serene. She had no intention of winning the box. She hadn't the funds to spare, but she wanted to see how Vane reacted to her interest. Sure enough, his smile faltered, and he rushed the bidding, closing it at £30 to Mrs. Bantry. Interesting, Miss Marple thought. He hadn't wanted her to linger on the box. She made a mental note to visit Mrs. Bantry later and inspect her purchase. As the auction continued, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her inquiries. Mrs. McGillicuddy's letter had arrived that morning, tucked into her post-box with a hurried scrawl. It was disappointingly vague, no record of a Clarence Vane in Bombay's railway circles, but a mention of a man named Victor Crane, who'd swindled investors in Calcutta before vanishing. The names were close enough to raise suspicion, and Miss Marple had already written to another contact, Mr. Percival Fortescue, a retired banker in London with a memory for shady dealings. If Vane was Crane or connected to him, she would find out. The auction ended with a standing ovation for Vane, who bowed modestly and announced that the funds, nearly £200, would be delivered to the orphanage by week's end. The crowd dispersed, buzzing with praise for their benefactor, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Vane as he packed away the unsold items. She noticed him slip the jewelry box into a leather satchel, his movements quick and guarded. That evening, she called on Mrs. Bantry, who was delighted to show off her new acquisition. The jewelry box sat on her parlor table, its mother of pearl glinting in the lamplight. "Isn't it divine?" Mrs. Bantry said, opening it to reveal a velvet-lined interior, empty save for a faint scent of lavender. "Quite," Miss Marple said, peering inside. The scratches around the keyhole were more pronounced up close, and the lock felt loose as if it had been forced. "Did Mr. Vane handle the delivery himself?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry said. "He brought it over this afternoon, so kind of." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the possibilities. An empty jewelry box was no great prize, but its condition suggested it had held something valuable or incriminating. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and returned home, her thoughts churning. The next morning, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, penning a letter to Mr. Fortescue. She described Vane's appearance, his mannerisms, and the curious case of the jewelry. Box asking if he recalled any similar incidents in London's financial circles. As she sealed the envelope, a knock came at her door. It was young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's apprentice, his cap askew and his face flushed. "Miss Marple, ma'am," he said, breathless. "Mrs. Clement sent me. She's in a state about that jewelry box. Says it's not hers after all." "Not hers?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. "How curious. Tell me everything, Tommy." He explained that Mrs. Clement had visited Mrs. Bantry that morning and recognized the box as a cheap imitation, not the heirloom she'd donated. The original, she insisted, had a secret compartment and a monogram inside the lid. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A switched item suggested more than carelessness. It suggested intent. She thanked Tommy and sent him off with a shilling, then hurried to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was in the parlor, wringing her hands as she recounted the discovery. "It's not my mother's box, Jane," she said, near tears. "The real one had her initials E.M. Con, a hidden drawer for her love letters. This one's just a trinket." Miss Marple examined the imitation box, which Mrs. Bantry had returned to the vicarage. It was well made, but lacked the craftsmanship of a true heirloom. "And you're certain you gave the real one to Mr. Vane?" she asked. "Positive," Mrs. Clement said. "I handed it to him myself." Miss Marple's mind raced. Vane had switched the boxes, but why? To sell the original for profit. or to conceal something hidden in that secret compartment. She reassured Mrs. Clement and promised to look into it, then returned home to await Mr. Fortescue's reply. The letter arrived 2 days later, and it was a gold mine. Mr. Fortescue recalled a Victor Crane who'd operated in London a decade ago, using charity auctions to launder stolen goods. He'd often hidden valuables like forged bonds or smuggled gems in the secret compartments of antique boxes, passing them to accomplices under the guise of legitimate sales. The description matched Vane's methods too closely to be coincidence. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting forgotten. The auction had been a success, with no crime evident yet, but the switched jewelry box suggested Vane was playing a longer game, perhaps using the auction to move something illicit through St. Mary Mead. She felt a quiet satisfaction at piecing together this much, but the puzzle was far from complete. Vane was clever, and she would need to be clever. She spent the next day visiting the orphanage, ostensibly to inquire about the auction funds. The matron, Miss Hartnell, confirmed that Vane had delivered a check, but it was drawn on a London bank she didn't recognize. Miss Marple made a note of the bank's name, Harrington, and Sons, and resolved to check its legitimacy through her contacts. As she walked home, the village green was quiet, the Fates' bunting now tattered by the wind. Miss Marple's thoughts were anything but calm. Vane's charity auction had won him the village's trust, but she saw it for what it was, a performance, a sleight of hand to distract from his true motives. The switched jewelry box was a clue, but not the whole picture. She would need to dig deeper, to follow the threads to London and beyond. For now she was content with her progress. Her file on Vane was growing names, dates, discrepancies, and each piece brought her closer to unmasking him. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, and a small smile played on her lips. Mr. Clarence Vane might think himself the cleverest man in St. Mary Mead, but he had yet to meet his match. Chapter 5. A shadow in the ledger. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths that wound through the village. The air carried a crisp bite, and the leaves in their fiery hues of amber and crimson swirled gently to the ground. Miss Jane Marple sat in the vicarage parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she listened to the vicar, Mr. Clement, drone on about the parish accounts. Her eyes, sharp and bright behind her spectacles, flickered occasionally to the ledger spread open on the table before them. It was an unremarkable scene, one that any villager might have passed over without a second thought. But to Miss Marple it was a battlefield, and the ledger was a map dotted with hidden traps. The vicar, a kindly man with a penchant for tangents, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in Miss Marple's mind. "You see, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his glasses, "the donations from Mr. Vane's charity auction have been quite generous indeed. The church roof fund is nearly complete, and I dare say we'll have enough for the new hymnals as well." Miss Marple's lips curved into a polite smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Clarence Vane, the charming newcomer with his tailored suits and easy smile, had become the talk of St. Mary Mead. His charity auction, held in the village hall just a week prior, had been a dazzling success. The gentry had parted with their pounds for antique vases, silver candlesticks, and even a questionable painting of a horse that Miss Marple privately thought resembled a cow. Vane had orchestrated it all with the finesse of a conductor, his voice warm and persuasive, his gestures grand yet sincere. The village adored him, but Miss Marple did not. Quite remarkable, isn't it? Mr. Clement continued, flipping a page in the ledger. The totals are all here, and I've cross-checked them myself. Everything seems in order. Miss Marple's. Needles paused. In order, you say? Her voice was soft, almost absent-minded, but there was a glint in her eye that might have warned a keener observer. Might I take a closer look, Mr. Clement? My old eyes aren't what they used to be, but I do find numbers soothing. The vicar chuckled. Of course, Miss Marple. Though I warn you, it's dreadfully dull work. He slid the ledger toward her, oblivious to the fact that he had just handed a bloodhound a scent. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned over the ledger, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures. The donations were listed meticulously. Mrs. Price Ridley's £10 for a porcelain teapot, Colonel Bantry's $15 for a brass fire screen, even young Tommy Pierce's £6 for a chipped ceramic dog. But it was the totals at the bottom of each page that drew her attention. They were tidy, precise, and Miss Marple's instincts whispered wrong. She flipped back to the previous page, her brow furrowing slightly. The numbers danced before her, a puzzle begging to be solved. There was a pattern, subtle but unmistakable, in the way certain sums were rounded or adjusted. A shilling here, a pound there, siphoned off like cream skimmed from milk. It was clever, almost invisible, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing the invisible. Mr. Clement, she said, her tone light. Do you recall who tallied these figures? Why, Mr. Vane himself offered to help, the vicar replied, beaming. He's quite the mathematician, you know. Said it was no trouble at all. No trouble at all, Miss Marple echoed, her smile tightening. She closed the ledger with a gentle thud. You've been most helpful, Vicar. I think I'll take a stroll now. The air does wonders for one's clarity. As she stepped out into the village, the late afternoon light bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow. The high street bustled with its usual rhythm, Mrs. Weatherby gossiping outside the post office, the butcher's boy whistling as he swept the shop front, children darting through the lanes with sticky toffee apples. But Miss Marple's mind was far from the idyllic scene. Clarence Vane was a puzzle, and the ledger was a piece that didn't quite fit. She made her way to the village hall, where the remnants of the auction were still being cleared away. A few volunteers lingered, stacking chairs and boxing up unsold knickknacks. Among them was Miss Clarice Hartnell, a spinster with a penchant for organization and a memory sharper than most gave her credit for. Good afternoon, Clarice, Miss Marple said, her voice warm as she approached. You've been such a help with the auction. I don't know how we'd manage without you. Miss Hartnell flushed, pleased. Oh, it's nothing, Miss Marple, just doing my bit for the church. And a fine bit it is, Miss Marple said, settling onto a nearby chair as if to rest her legs. I was just looking over the accounts with Mr. Clement. Mr. Vane's been quite the asset, hasn't he? So generous with his time. Miss Hartnell's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something passing across her face. Oh, yes, very generous, though. She hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were alone. I did find it odd, Miss Marple. He insisted on handling the cash donations himself. Said it was easier that way. But I saw him tucking some of the notes into a separate envelope. I thought perhaps it was for another cause, but he never mentioned it. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. An envelope, you say? How curious. Did you happen to see where he kept it? In his satchel, Miss Hartnell replied, lowering her voice. The leather one he carries everywhere. I didn't think much of it at the time, but, well, it's not the usual way, is it? Not at all, Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. You've a sharp eye, Clarice. I dare say you'd make a fine detective. Miss Hartnell laughed, waving a hand. Oh, go on with you, Miss Marple. I'm just a nosy old maid. But as Miss Marple bid her farewell and continued her stroll, her thoughts were anything but idle. The satchel, the envelope, the ledger's subtle discrepancies. They were threads in a tapestry, and she was beginning to see the pattern. That evening, Miss Marple attended a village meeting at the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Vane was to give report on the auction's success. The room was packed, the air thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke. Vane stood at the front, his voice smooth as silk, his smile disarming. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I am delighted to report that our little auction has raised a splendid sum for the church roof. Thanks to your generosity, we've collected nearly £200. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple, seated near the back, clapped politely, but her eyes were fixed on Vane. His confidence was unshakable, his manner impeccable. Yet there was something in the way he lingered on certain words, the way his gaze swept the room, that reminded her of a fox circling a henhouse. When the meeting ended, she lingered, watching as Vane chatted with the villagers. He was a master of deflection, turning questions into compliments, doubts into laughter, but Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. As the crowd thinned, she approached him, her expression one of benign curiosity. Mr. Vane, she said, I must congratulate you on such a successful event. The ledger must have been quite a task to manage. He turned to her, his smile never faltering. Not at all, Miss Marple. Numbers are a hobby of mine. I find them rather comforting. How interesting, she said, her tone mild. I was just looking over the accounts myself. There were a few figures that seemed unusual. Nothing serious, of course, but I thought you might clarify them for me. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Vane's eyes' surprise. Perhaps, or wariness, but he recovered quickly. Unusual? I'm sure it's just a clerical error. I'd be happy to go over it with you. Perhaps tomorrow? Oh, no need to trouble yourself, Miss Marple said, waving a hand. I'm sure. It's nothing. Just an old woman's fussing. But as she turned away, she felt his gaze on her back, sharp and calculating. She had planted a seed, and she knew it would take root. Vane was clever, but he was not infallible, and Miss Marple had a knack for finding cracks in even the most polished facades. Over the next few days she made discreet enquiries. She chatted with the postmistress about Vane's correspondence, with the grocer about his purchases, with the milkman about his comings and goings. Each conversation added a piece to the puzzle. Vane was careful, but not careful enough. A letter sent to a London address. A purchase of fine stationery, far too expensive for a man of his supposed means. A late night walk to the edge of the night. Village where he met a stranger in a dark coat dot. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had a plan. She invited Mr. Clement and a few trusted villagers, Miss Hartnell, Colonel Bantry, and Mrs. Price Ridley, to her cottage for tea. The conversation began innocently enough with talk of the weather and the harvest festival, but as the teacups clinked and the scones dwindled, Miss Marple steered the discussion toward the auction. "I've been thinking about our dear Mr. Vane," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "He's done so much for the village, hasn't he? But I wonder, does anyone know where the cash donations are kept? I only ask because I heard the most curious thing from Clarice." Miss Hartnell, eager to share, recounted her observation about the envelope. Colonel Bantry, ever practical, frowned. "That's not proper procedure, is it? Cash should be deposited straightaway." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea, "and I couldn't help but notice a few oddities in the ledger. Small amounts, you understand, but they do add up." Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on her financial acumen, bristled. "Are you suggesting Mr. Vane is mismanaging funds?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said quickly. "But it might be wise to double-check. For the church's sake, of course." The seed was sown. By the next morning, whispers had spread through St. Mary Mead. The villagers, once dazzled by Vane's charm, began to question his motives. A few even approached him directly, asking pointed questions about the auction funds. Vane, ever the performer, deflected with ease, but Miss Marple saw the strain in his smile. The turning point came on Sunday, after the morning service. Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, ostensibly to admire the roses, but in truth to overhear a conversation between Vane and Mr. Pye, the local solicitor. They stood near the yew tree, their voices low but audible to Miss Marple's keen ears. "It's all under control," Vane was saying. "The funds are safe and the next phase is ready. Just keep the investors calm." Mr. Pye, a nervous man with a habit of fidgeting, nodded. "But the ledgers some of the ladies are asking questions. That Marple woman especially. She's sharper than she looks." Vane's laugh was sharp, like glass. "Miss Marple? She's a harmless old biddy. Let her poke around. She'll find nothing." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Harmless old biddy, indeed." She slipped away before they noticed her, her mind alight with possibilities. The next phase could only mean one thing. Vane's schemes were far from over, but she had rattled him, and that was enough for now. That afternoon she returned to the vicarage with a renewed sense of purpose. "Mr. Clement," she said, "I think it's time we audited the auction funds properly. With your permission, I'd like to bring in Mr. Haydock from the next village. He's an accountant, and quite discreet." The vicar, flustered by the growing whispers, agreed readily. Mr. Haydock arrived the next day, a dour man with a passion for precision. Together he and Miss Marple pored over the ledger, cross-referencing receipts and bank deposits. It took hours, but they found it, a series of small, almost undetectable discrepancies. 5 shillings here, 10 there, funneled into an account that didn't belong to the church. "It's clever," Mr. Haydock admitted, peering over his glasses. "Whoever did this knew how to hide their tracks, but it's theft, plain and simple." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Thank you, Mr. Haydock. I think we've done enough for today." That evening she convened another meeting at the vicarage, this time with the church committee. She presented their findings carefully, avoiding any direct accusation. "It seems there's been a mistake in the accounts," she said. Nothing serious, but we wouldn't want any misunderstandings, would we? The committee, alarmed, agreed to secure the funds immediately. By the next morning, the auction money was safely deposited in the church's official account, beyond Vane's reach. Miss Marple watched from her cottage window as he passed by, his satchel slung over his shoulder, his face a mask of frustration. She had thwarted him, for now Dot, as she settled into her armchair that evening, her knitting resumed its steady rhythm. The ledger was safe, the funds secure, and the village's trust in Vane shaken. But Miss Marple was not one to rest on her laurels. Vane was planning something bigger. She could feel it in her bones. And she would be ready. The fire crackled in the grate, casting warm shadows across the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the secrets of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her needles clicking like the ticking of a clock. Time, she knew, was on her side. Chapter 6. The Bait of Greed. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a deceptively tranquil glow. The air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, and the high street hummed with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Mrs. Price's bakery sending out wafts of warm bread, the postman whistling as he cycled past, and the occasional clatter of teacups from the Blue Boar Inn. But beneath this idyllic surface, a current of unease rippled through the village, stirred by the charismatic yet slippery Mr. Clarence Vane. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, darted occasionally to the window, where she could see the village green. There a small crowd had gathered, drawn by a hand-painted sign announcing an exclusive investment opportunity, hosted by Mr. Vane at the village hall that evening. The sign, with its bold letters and promises of unprecedented returns, had been the talk of St. Mary Mead for days. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen such signs before, not in their literal form, perhaps, but in the glint of a conman's eye, the too smooth cadence of a practiced lyre. She set her knitting aside and reached for the cup of Earl Grey on the table beside her. The steam curled upward, and she inhaled its bergamot scent, her mind sifting through the events of the past weeks. Vane had woven himself into the fabric of the village with alarming ease. His charm, his tailored suits, his carefully timed acts of generosity. But Miss Marple had not been idle. She had watched him at the church fundraiser, noted the widows, near disaster with her savings, and uncovered the faint trail of irregularities in the charity auctions accounts. Each step had confirmed her suspicion. Vane was no mere opportunist. He was a predator, and his latest scheme this investment. Opportunity smelled of ambition far grander than anything he'd attempted before. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 4. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and glanced at the mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection showed a slight elderly woman with a neat bun and a serene expression, but her eyes held a glint of determination. Tonight she would attend Vane's presentation, not as the unassuming spinster the village knew, but as a potential investor curious, slightly naive, and just wealthy enough to tempt a man like Vane. It was a role she had played before, and she played it well. The village hall was ablaze with light as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the rows of chairs, most of which were already occupied by the village's more affluent residents. Squire Bantry, red-faced and jovial, sat near the front with his wife, Dolly, who fanned herself with a lace handkerchief. The widowed Mrs. Clement, her eyes bright with hope, clutched a notebook as if preparing to jot down a recipe for wealth. Even young Dr. Haydock, usually skeptical of such ventures, had shown up, his arms crossed, but his curiosity evident. The air buzzed with anticipation, tinged with the kind of greed that Vane knew how to stoke. Miss Marple slipped into a seat near the back, her gray shawl draped over her shoulders, and a modest brooch pinned to her blouse. She carried a small, leather-bound notebook, a prop to signal her interest, and adjusted her spectacles as she scanned the room. Vane stood at the front, impeccable in a navy suit, his dark hair slicked back and his smile as polished as ever. He was shaking hands with Mr. Pye, the local solicitor, who seemed unusually animated, his usual dourness replaced by a flush of excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vane began, his voice smooth as velvet, "tonight marks the beginning of something extraordinary for St. Mary Mead, an opportunity not just to preserve your wealth, but to multiply it tenfold, perhaps 20-fold, in a matter of months." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Vane paced the small stage, his movements deliberate, his eyes catching the light like those of a showman. He spoke of a shipping venture, an enterprise importing rare silks and spices from the Far East, backed by a consortium of London investors. The details were vague enough to sound plausible, yet specific enough to dazzle. Ships departing from Bombay, contracts with reputable merchants, guaranteed returns of 15% within 6 months. He produced a leather folder, which he opened with a flourish, revealing documents stamped with official-looking seals. Miss Marple watched closely, her fingers resting lightly on her notebook. The seals were impressive, but something about their uniformity nagged at her. She had seen forged documents before during her nephew Raymond's brief entanglement with a shady art dealer, and these had the same overly precise look, as if crafted by someone trying too hard to convince. "Who among you," Vane continued, his voice rising, "wants to secure their family's future, to leave a legacy that echoes beyond your years? This is no gamble, my friends. This is certainty, backed by the finest minds in commerce." Squire Bantry leaned forward, his mustache twitching. "Sounds promising, Vane. But what's the catch?" "There's always a catch." Vane's smile didn't falter. "No catch, Squire. Only opportunity. The minimum investment is £500, a modest sum for the returns promised. And for those who act tonight, I'll personally ensure a bonus share in the venture's first profits." Mrs. Clement gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her chest. £500? Oh, but think of what that could mean for my grandchildren. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She opened her notebook and scribbled a few words, her handwriting small and precise. Minimum investment, urgency, bonus share. These were the hallmarks of a confidence trick designed to prey on greed and haste. She glanced at Vane, who was now handing out glossy pamphlets, each embossed with a crest that looked suspiciously like the one on his handkerchief, the same handkerchief she'd found near Lady Harrington's stolen brooch dot as the crowd buzzed. Miss Marple rose and approached Vane, her steps slow and deliberate. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm most intrigued by your proposal. I've a modest sum from my late brother's estate, nothing grand, mind you, but perhaps enough to join your venture. Might I see those contracts?" Vane's eyes flickered with interest, though his smile remained fixed. "Of course, Miss Marple. A prudent lady like yourself deserves every assurance." He handed her a document from his folder, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a calculated gesture, she noted, meant to charm. She took the contract, her eyes scanning the text. The language was dense, filled with legal jargon, but her years of reading her nephew's manuscripts had taught her too. Spot fluff. The document referenced a Maritime Ventures Ltd., with an address in London's Cheapside district. The numbers, projected profits, timelines, cargo weights were oddly round, lacking the irregularity of real data. And there at the bottom was a signature, Edmund Clarence Vane, Director. The flourish was too perfect, the ink too fresh. "Thank you, Mr. Vane," she said, folding the contract and tucking it into her handbag. "I'll need to review this with my solicitor, of course. One can't be too careful." "Naturally," Vane replied, though his jaw tightened slightly. "But do act swiftly, Miss Marple. Opportunities like this vanish quickly." She smiled, her expression guileless. "Oh, I'm quite nimble when I need to be." That night, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the contract spread out before her under the soft glow of a lamp. Her cat, Tuppence, curled at her feet, purring softly. She adjusted her spectacles and began copying key phrases into her notebook, her mind working as swiftly as her pen. The address in Cheapside was a start. She would write to her friend, Mrs. McGillicuddy, whose cousin worked in the city, to verify its legitimacy. But it was the numbers that intrigued her most. They were too neat, too optimistic. Real investments, she knew from her modest dabbling in railway bonds, were messy, fraught with variables. The next morning she strolled to the post office, her letter to Mrs. McGillicuddy sealed and stamped. Mrs. Price, behind the counter, greeted her with a conspiratorial whisper. "Heard you were at Vane's meeting last night, Miss Marple." "What do you make of him?" "Oh, he's a charming man," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "But charm, you know, can be a slippery thing, like icing on a cake that's gone stale." Mrs. Price chuckled, handing her a receipt. "You've a way with words, miss. I'll wager you've got his measure." Miss Marple smiled, but said nothing, her mind already on the next step. She needed to see Vane's operation up close, not just his polished presentations, but the machinery behind them. And for that she would need an ally. The opportunity came 2 days later at the Blue Boar Inn, where the village's younger set gathered for a darts tournament. Miss Marple, claiming a sudden fondness for the game, arrived with a basket of scones as a contribution to the evening's refreshments. Among the players was Tommy Beresford, a bright young man who worked as a clerk at the local bank. Tommy, with his quick wit and knack for numbers, had once helped Miss Marple untangle a neighbor's tax muddle, and she trusted his instincts. "Tommy, dear," she said, offering him a scone during a break, "I wonder if you might humor an old woman's curiosity? This investment scheme of Mr. Vane's, have you seen any of the paperwork at the bank?" Tommy grinned, brushing crumbs from his jacket. "You're not one for idle gossip, Miss Marple, so I'll bet there's more to this. The bank's seen a few transfers, small ones, mind you, to an account in London. All above board, as far as I can tell. But, she prompted, her eyes twinkling. He lowered his voice. The account's with a private firm, not one of the big banks. And the transfers are always just under the threshold that triggers a review. Clever, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clever indeed. Might you keep an eye on those transfers, Tommy? Discreetly, of course. For you, Miss Marple, anything? He winked, then returned to his darts, leaving her. To sip her tea and ponder Dot over the next week, Miss Marple played her part to perfection. She attended Vane's follow-up meeting, asking pointed but polite questions about shipping routes and profit margins. She dropped hints about her inheritance, enough to keep Vane's interest without committing funds. And she watched as the village elite squire Bantry, Mrs. Clement, even the cautious Dr. Haydock began to waver, their greed outweighing their doubts. But it was at the third meeting, held in the grand parlor of Squire Bantry's manor, that Miss Marple found her opening. Vane, emboldened by the crowd's enthusiasm, produced a new set of documents, promissory notes, he called them, guaranteeing returns. As he passed them around, Miss Marple noticed a faint watermark on one, barely visible under the chandelier's light. It was a crest, but not the one on his pamphlets. This one was older, slightly smudged, and bore the initials J.H. She excused herself to the powder room, her heart quickening. In the quiet of the manor's hallway, she examined the note. More closely, using a small magnifying glass she kept in her handbag. The watermark was from a defunct paper mill in Bristol, one she recalled from a case involving forged bonds years ago. The initials, she suspected, belonged to a printer Vane had employed, a careless mistake on his part. Back in the parlor, she resumed her role, complimenting Vane on the professional documents while noting the reactions of the others. Squire. Bantry was ready to sign, his pen hovering over the note. Mrs. Clement clutched hers like a talisman. Only Dr. Haydock hesitated, his brow furrowed. Mr. Vane, Miss Marple said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. These notes are quite impressive, but I wonder how are the profits distributed if, say, one of the ships is delayed? My brother, you see, once invested in a venture that promised much but delivered little when storm struck. The room stilled. Vane's smile tightened, but he recovered quickly. A fair question, Miss Marple. The contracts account for such risks, force majeure, we call it. The profits are insured, so your investment is safe. Insured, she repeated, her tone thoughtful. How reassuring. And the insurers? Name? Vane hesitated, a fraction of a second, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. A reputable firm in London, he said smoothly. I'll provide the details to all investors tomorrow. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. I look forward to it. That night she wrote another letter, this time to her nephew Raymond, who had contacts in Bristol. She described the watermark, the initials, and her suspicions about the printer. By morning she had Tommy's report. 3 more transfers to the London account, each just under the threshold. The pieces were falling into place, but Vane was moving fast. If she didn't act soon, the village's savings would vanish into his pockets. The next day she invited Squire Bantry and Dr. Haydock to her cottage for tea. Over scones and her best china, she laid out her concerns, not as accusations, but as curiosities from an old woman who'd seen too many schemes in her time. She mentioned the watermark, the transfers, the vague insurer. Dr. Haydock, ever the skeptic, agreed to verify the London firm. Squire Bantry, though reluctant, promised to hold off signing until they knew more by evening. Word had spread. Mrs. Clement, shaken by a private chat with Miss Marple, withdrew her investment. 2 others followed, citing personal reasons. Vane, at the next meeting, was visibly strained, his charm fraying at the edges. Miss Marple sat in the back, her knitting in her lap, as Vane tried to salvage his pitch. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a touch too loud, "hesitation is the enemy of progress. Those who act now will reap the rewards." But the mood had shifted. The crowd's greed, once a roaring flame, had cooled to embers. Miss Marple caught Dr. Haydock's eye and gave a slight nod. He stood, clearing his throat. "Mr. Vane, I've checked with my contacts in London. There's no record of your insurer. Care to explain?" Vane's face paled, but he rallied. Clerical error, I'm sure. I'll have it corrected by tomorrow." "Tomorrow may be too late," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the room. "Trust, once lost, is hard to regain." The crowd erupted in whispers. Vane's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw not the polished swindler, but a cornered animal. He excused himself, promising answers soon, and left the hall in a hurry. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, Tuppence purring beside her. She was satisfied Vane's scheme was unraveling, his investors slipping away, but she knew he wasn't finished. A man like Vane didn't give up easily. He would pivot, adapt, perhaps even strike back. She opened her notebook and added a new entry, watermark, printer J.H. Bristol. Then she smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of the forged contract. The game was far from over, but for now St. Mary Mead was safe. And Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 7. The midnight visitor. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silver sheen across the thatched roofs and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking softly in the stillness. The village slept, but her mind was alert, turning over the puzzle of Clarence Vane. The man's polished charm and calculated generosity had wormed him into the village's heart. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human foibles, whispered of deceit. His latest venture, a charity auction that had dazzled the gentry, had left no tangible crime to pin on him, but the irregularities she'd found in the vicar's ledger gnawed at her. Vane was no petty swindler. His game was intricate, and she suspected he was closing in on a grander prize. Tonight she felt a prickle of anticipation. Her subtle inquiries at the village post office had revealed Vane received frequent letters from London, always in plain envelopes with no return address. Her discreet audit of the charity funds had unsettled him. She'd seen it in the flicker of his smile at the last church tea. If Vane suspected her scrutiny, he might act rashly. And so she waited, her cottage dark save for a single candle, flickering on the table, her senses attuned to the night. A faint creak broke the silence, not from within but outside, near the garden gate. Miss Marple's needles paused. She set them down, her movements deliberate, and rose, drawing her shawl closer. The clock on the mantel showed midnight. No honest soul would be abroad at such an hour in St. Mary Mead. Slipping to the window, she peered through a gap in the lace curtains. The garden was a mosaic of shadows, the rose bushes swaying in a gentle breeze. Then a shape moved, a figure, cloaked and cautious, edging along the hedge toward her back door. Her pulse quickened, but her mind remained cool. She had anticipated this. Vane, or someone in his employ, must suspect she held evidence, perhaps. Her notes on his inconsistencies, tucked into a notebook she kept locked in her desk. She had prepared for such a moment. Crossing to the hearth, she retrieved a small brass key from behind a porcelain shepherdess and unlocked a drawer in her writing desk. Inside lay her true notebook, filled with observations on Vane's movements and connections. Beside it was a decoy, a worn diary filled with mundane musings on gardening and village gossip, laced with just enough vague suspicion about Vane to seem plausible. She placed the decoy on her desk, slightly askew, as if left in haste, and hid the real notebook beneath a loose floorboard under the rug. The back door's lock gave a faint scrape. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The intruder was bold but not skilled. A professional thief would have been quieter. She extinguished the candle, plunging the parlor into darkness, and moved silently to the hallway, where she could observe the kitchen door. Her heart beat steadily. She was no stranger to danger, though she preferred to outwit it rather than confront it. The kitchen door eased open, and a figure slipped inside, a man by the bulk of his silhouette. He carried no lantern, relying on the moonlight filtering through the window. His boots made soft thuds on the flagstones as he crept toward the parlor. Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. The intruder paused at the parlor threshold, his head turning as if sensing a trap. Then, with a quick step, he crossed to the desk and began rifling through the papers. She strained to see his face, but a scarf masked his features, and a cap was pulled low over his eyes. His hands, gloved, moved with purpose, seizing the decoy diary. He flipped through it, his breath hissing in frustration. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The diary would keep him occupied, its cryptic entries designed to mislead hints of a meeting with a non-existent magistrate, a reference to a London dossier she'd never compiled. But she needed more than a thwarted theft. She needed to know who this man was and whether Vane himself had sent him. Slipping back to the kitchen, she retrieved a heavy iron skillet from the stove, her movements soundless. She had no intention of wielding it, but its weight was reassuring. Returning to the hallway, she positioned herself near the parlor door, ready to act if the intruder turned violent. The man pocketed the diary and moved toward the window, perhaps intending to exit as he'd entered. Miss Marple stepped forward, deliberately letting her foot scuff the floor. The intruder froze, his head whipping toward the sound. In the moonlight, she caught a glint of wide eyes beneath the cap. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm but quavering just enough to suggest a frightened spinster. "I've called for the constable." The man bolted, not for the window, but back toward the kitchen. Miss Marple followed, skillet in hand, keeping her distance, but ensuring he heard her pursuit. He stumbled over a chair in the kitchen, cursing. Under his breath, a coarse London accent. She noted and flung open the back door, vanishing into the garden. She reached the doorstep in time to see him vault the low fence and disappear into the lane beyond. She closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, her breath steadying. The intruder was gone, but he'd left something behind. Kneeling by the chair he'd overturned, she spotted a small object glinting on the floor. A cufflink, silver, engraved with the initial R. She picked it up, turning it in her fingers. Not Vane's his initials were CV, but perhaps a clue to his accomplice. Morning brought a bustle of activity to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, refreshed after a few hours' sleep, donned her tweed coat and set out for the village shop, the cufflink tucked safely in her handbag. The shop, run by the garrulous Mrs. Bantry, was a hub of gossip, and Miss Marple intended to stir the pot. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Bantry called, her apron dusted with flour. "Heard the news? Mr. Vane's hired a new man to help with his auction accounts. A Londoner, they say, arrived last night on the late train." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Indeed? What's his name? Roper, I think. Tom Roper, staying at the Blue Boar. Bit of a rough sort, if you ask me, but Mr. Vane swears he's trustworthy." "Roper," Miss Marple murmured, filing the name away. The initial R matched her cufflink. "How interesting. I must meet this Mr. Roper." She lingered at the shop, chatting about the weather and the upcoming harvest festival. But her mind was elsewhere. Roper's arrival coincided too neatly with the midnight intrusion. Vane, she suspected, was tightening his grip on the village, and Roper was likely his enforcer, a man sent to tidy up loose ends, including her dot at noon. She visited the Blue Boar, the village's only inn, under the pretense of delivering a knitted blanket for the landlord's newborn. The taproom was quiet, save for a stranger nursing a pint in the corner. He was broad-shouldered, with a scarred cheek and a cap pulled low much like her intruder. His boots, caked with mud, matched the tracks she'd found in her garden at dawn. "Good day, sir," she said brightly, pausing near his table. "You? Must be Mr. Roper, newly arrived. Welcome to St. Mary Mead." The man's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Aye, that's me. And you are?" "Miss Marple, a neighbor of sorts. I hear you're assisting Mr. Vane. Such a generous man, isn't he?" Roper grunted, his gaze flickering to her handbag. "Generous? Sure. What's it to you?" "Oh, just village curiosity," she said, her smile disarming. "We're a close-knit lot here. Do mind your step at night. The lanes can be treacherous." His hand twitched, and she noted the absence of a cufflink on his left sleeve. Satisfied, she bid him farewell and left, her heart racing with triumph. Roper was her man, and his unease confirmed he'd recognized her voice from the night before. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple brewed a pot of tea and sat at her kitchen table, the cufflink before her. Roper's connection to Vane was clear, but she needed more proof that would tie them to a crime, not just a clumsy break-in. She recalled Vane's upcoming meeting with the village council, where he planned to propose a new investment scheme. If Roper was his muscle, he might be tasked with intimidating skeptics or silencing prying spinsters. She spent the afternoon crafting a second trap. At the council meeting, she would play the doddering fool, asking pointed questions about Vane's finances to provoke a reaction. If Roper was there, he might reveal himself or Vane's impatience through her. Meanwhile, she wrote to her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with contacts in London, asking him to inquire about a Tom Roper in criminal circles. She sealed the letter, her pen pausing as she considered the risks. Vane was cunning, and Roper was dangerous. Yet she felt a quiet thrill. She was closing in. The council meeting was held in the village hall, a draughty room packed with farmers, shopkeepers, and gentry. Vane stood at the podium, his voice smooth as he outlined a plan to fund a new community, all through private investments. Miss Marple sat in the front row, her knitting in her lap, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Mr. Vane," she said during the question period, her voice tremulous, "your plan sounds splendid, but might we see the financial projections? My late brother was ever so particular about such things." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Vane's smile tightened. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll provide a full report next week." "And the escrow account?" she pressed, her tone innocent. "Is it local or managed in London? One hears such dreadful stories of mismanaged funds." The room grew quiet. Vane's eyes flicked to the back, where Roper lounged against the wall, his cap shadowing his face. "All funds are secure," Vane said, his voice clipped. "I assure you, madam, my reputation is impeccable." "Oh, I'm sure it is," she said, beaming. "Only we're such a cautious lot in St. Mary Mead." As the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple lingered, chatting with the vicar's wife. She sensed Roper's gaze on her, heavy and calculating. When she stepped outside into the dusk, she heard footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace, her hand tightening on her umbrella, but the footsteps faded. Glancing back, she saw Roper vanish into an alley, his silhouette unmistakable. That night she fortified her cottage locking windows, propping a chair under the back door's handle. She slept lightly, waking at every creak, but no intruder came. By morning her resolve had hardened. Roper's presence was a sign Vane was rattled, and rattled men made mistakes. Over the next days Miss Marple observed Roper closely. He frequented the Blue Boar, meeting strangers who arrived by train and left swiftly. She noted their descriptions in her hidden notebook, along with the times of their meetings. One evening she overheard Roper arguing with Vane outside the inn, their voices low but tense. "She's sniffing too close," Roper growled. "Let me handle her." "No," Vane snapped. "She's just an old busybody. Stick to the plan." Miss Marple's heart pounded, but she felt a surge of satisfaction. Her meddling was working. She doubled her efforts, enlisting the postmistress to flag any suspicious letters for Vane or Roper. A package arrived for Roper, marked from a London jeweler. Curious, she recalled the stolen brooch from Lady Harrington's manor. Could Roper be fencing stolen goods for Vane? On the 5th day, Raymond's reply arrived. Tom Roper was known to Scotland Yard as a petty enforcer for a London gang, recently linked to a swindler named Victor Crane Vane's true name, Miss Marple suspected. The pieces were falling into place. She penned a letter to Inspector Craddock, her old friend at the county police, summarizing her findings and enclosing the cufflink as evidence of Roper's trespass. As she posted the letter, she spotted Roper watching her from across the green. Their eyes met, and he tipped his cap, a mocking gesture. She returned a serene smile, her mind racing. The game was escalating, but she was ready. Vane's empire of lies was crumbling, and she would be there to see it fall. The chapter closed. With Miss Marple at her parlor window, the village quiet once more, she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. Roper's intrusion had been a gambit, but she'd turned it to her advantage. The cufflink, the overheard argument, Raymond's letter, all were threads in her web. She was satisfied with her vigilance, content that her trap had held, and eager for the next move in this delicate dance with a wily trickster. Chapter 8. The gossip's gambit. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting golden streaks across the cobblestone paths and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The village buzzed with the usual hum of daily life. Mrs. Price haggling over apples at the market, the postman whistling as he made his rounds, but beneath the surface Miss Marple sensed the undercurrent of unease that Mr. Clarence Vane had stirred. His polished charm and generous gestures had won over many, but not her. She had spent weeks observing his movements, piecing together the subtle threads of his schemes, and now she was ready to act not with confrontation, but with something far more potent in a village like St. Mary Mead. Gossip. Miss Marple sat, her knitting aside, and adjusted her spectacles. She had always believed that the power of words, when wielded with precision, could unravel even the most carefully constructed facade. Vane's allies, those villagers who had fallen under his spell, needed to be shaken, their trust in him fractured. She would plant seeds of doubt, carefully crafted and delicately sown, to make them question the man they so admired. But it would require finesse. Too heavy a hand, and Vane would sense her interference. Too light, and the village would dismiss her efforts as idle chatter. She smiled faintly. St. Mary Mead was a stage, and she was about to direct a subtle but devastating performance. The opportunity presented itself that very afternoon at the Women's Institute meeting, held in the drafty village hall. The room smelled of polished wood and brewing tea, and the chatter of 24 women filled the air as they arranged plates of scones and debated the merits of this year's flower show. Miss Marple, seated near the back with a cup of Earl Grey, listened as Mrs. Bantry, the Institute's president, called the meeting to order. "Now, ladies," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups, "we must finalize the plans for the autumn charity bazaar. Mr. Vane has so kindly offered to sponsor the event, and I think we should show our appreciation." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the faces. Mrs. Weatherby, the butcher's wife, nodded enthusiastically. Miss Hartnell, ever eager to align herself with wealth, clapped her hands. Even young Lucy Islesborough, usually so sharp, seemed taken by Vane's promise of funds. But Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, whose lips tightened ever so slightly. A crack in the facade day, perhaps. Such a generous man, Miss Hartnell gushed. "Why, just yesterday he told me he's planning to donate a painting for the auction. A genuine Turner, he says." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but said nothing. A Turner, indeed? Vane's stories grew bolder by the day, and she suspected this painting was as genuine as his tales of a noble lineage. She leaned forward, her voice soft but clear. "A Turner? How extraordinary," she said. "Though I do wonder how Mr. Vane came by such a piece. They're terribly rare, aren't they? I recall reading about a forgery scandal in London not long ago, some clever swindler passing off fakes to unsuspecting buyers." The room stilled for a moment. Mrs. Hartnell blinked, her enthusiasm faltering. "Well, I'm sure Mr. Vane wouldn't be involved in anything like that, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Of course not, Miss Marple agreed, her smile serene. But one does hear such stories. It's wise to be cautious, don't you think? Especially with someone so new to our little community. Mrs. Clement nodded slowly. Quite right, Jane. We don't know much about him, do we? He's charming, but charm can hide a great deal. The seed was planted. Miss Marple leaned back, satisfied. She had no need to press further. The women of St. Mary Mead were adept at nurturing a hint of doubt into full-blown suspicion. By the end of the meeting, whispers were already circulating. Had anyone seen Vane's credentials? Was his wealth truly his own? Miss Marple sipped her tea and listened, her expression one of mild interest, though inside she was calculating her next move. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry for tea at her cottage. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the lace tablecloth and the plate of homemade shortbread. Mrs. Bantry, a woman of hearty appetite and sharper mind than most gave her credit for, settled into an armchair with a sigh. "Jane, you're up to something," she said, reaching for a biscuit. "I saw that look at the meeting. You don't trust Mr. Vane, do you?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Dolly, you know I never jump to conclusions. But I do find it curious that a man of Mr. Vane's means chooses St. Mary Mead for his charity work. We're hardly London or Bath," Mrs. Bantry snorted. "Charity work. He's got half the village eating out of his hand. That auction of his raised a fortune, and now he's talking about some investment scheme. Sounds too good to be true, if you ask me." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, pouring more tea. "And when something seems too good to be true, it often is. I've been thinking about his associates, those men he brought to the auction. They didn't strike me as locals. Double quotes. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You mean that tall fellow with the mustache? And the one with the gold watch? I thought they were just friends of his." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but I couldn't help overhearing a snippet of their conversation at the auction. Something about a London contact and moving the funds. It sounded rather businesslike for a charity event." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Jane, you don't think?" "I think nothing yet," Miss Marple said quickly. "But I'd feel better if we knew more about Mr. Vane's friends. Dolly, you're friendly with Colonel Melchett. Might you ask if his contacts at Scotland Yard have heard of a certain Mr. Clarence Vane? Discreetly, of course." Mrs. Bantry grinned. "You're a sly one, Jane. I'll have a word with Arthur tomorrow. But what's your plan? You can't just go accusing the man without proof." "Oh, I shan't accuse anyone," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "But a little talk here and there can work wonders. People reveal more than they intend when they feel the eyes of the village upon them." The next morning Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her straw hat tilted against the sun. She paused at the post office, where Mrs. Blade, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. Blade," Miss Marple said, peering over the counter. "Busy as ever, I see. Have you had many letters for Mr. Vane lately? He must be quite the correspondent, with all his business ventures." Mrs. Blade, never one to miss a chance to share news, leaned forward. "Oh, he gets plenty, Miss Marple. Mostly from London, mind you. Thick envelopes, too, with fancy seals. I reckon he's got important friends." "Fancy seals?" Miss Marple's tone was one of polite curiosity. How interesting. I suppose they're from his charity contacts, though I did hear a rumor probably. Nonsense that some of his letters come from rather questionable sources. Mrs. Blade's eyes gleamed. Questionable, you say? Well, I wouldn't know about that, but I did notice one letter with a return address from a place in Cheapside. Not exactly the sort of address you'd expect for a gentleman like him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Cheapside? How curious. Well, I'm sure it's nothing. Thank you, Mrs. Blade. As she left the post office, Miss Marple felt a spark of satisfaction. Cheapside was hardly the haunt of philanthropists. If Vane was receiving letters from there, it suggested connections to a less savory world. She would need to confirm it, but for now the rumor mill was turning. Over the next few days, Miss Marple's carefully placed remarks spread like wildfire. At the butcher's, Mrs. Weatherby mentioned to a customer that she'd heard Vane's Turner might be a fake. At the pub, Mr. Hogg, the landlord, grumbled that Vane's associates had been asking odd questions about local estates. Even young Tommy, the baker's boy, reported that Vane's hired man had been seen loitering near the bank at odd hours. But the true breakthrough came at the village fete, held on the green under a sky of scudding clouds. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked pies and the laughter of children chasing a greased pig. Miss Marple, stationed at the knitting stall, kept an eye on Vane as he worked the crowd, shaking hands and flashing his dazzling smile. His associates were there too, the tall man with the mustache, whom she'd learned was called Mr. Ridley, and the one with the gold watch, a Mr. Stokes. They hovered at the edges, their eyes sharp and calculating. Miss Marple approached the refreshment tent where Mrs. Clement was serving lemonade. Such a lively fate, she remarked, accepting a glass. Mr. Vane seems in high spirits, though I did hear something odd about his friend, Mr. Ridley. Someone mentioned he was seen in London with a rather dubious character, a financier, I believe. Mrs. Clement's brow furrowed. A financier? That's strange. Mr. Ridley told me he was a retired schoolmaster. Why would he be mixed up with financiers? People do wear many hats, Miss Marple said, her tone light. But I suppose we'll know more soon. I heard Colonel Melchett's been making inquiries. The mention of the colonel was deliberate. Mrs. Clement, ever loyal to her husband's parish, would not let such a tidbit pass unremarked. Sure enough, by the end of the fete, the rumor had spread to half a dozen others, each adding their own embellishments. Miss Marple watched as Mr. Ridley, perhaps sensing the shift in the village's mood, grew visibly tense, his eyes darting toward Vane. That evening, Miss Marple's gambit bore fruit. She was pruning her roses when Mrs. Bantry hurried up the garden path, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe it," she said, clutching her hat. "Arthur spoke to Scotland Yard, and they've heard of a Mr. Ridley, not a schoolmaster, but a known associate of a swindler learned Victor Crane. He's a financier in London, and not the reputable kind." Miss Marple set down her shears, her expression calm, but her mind racing. "Victor Crane, you say? How very interesting. And Mr. Vane is connected to Mr. Ridley." "That's what Arthur thinks," Mrs. Bantry said. "He's passing the information to Inspector Craddock. Oh, Jane, you were right to be suspicious." "I only asked a few questions," Miss Marple said modestly. "The village does the rest." But inside she felt a quiet thrill. Ridley's slip had given her the lead she needed. Victor Crane was a name she could work with a thread to pull that might unravel Vane's entire network. She would pass the information to Inspector Craddock herself, ensuring it reached the right hands. For now she was content to let the village's whispers do their work, eroding Vane's carefully built trust. The following morning, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, penning a letter to Inspector Craddock. Her words were precise, detailing Ridley's connection to Crane and suggesting a discreet investigation into Vane's London ties. She sealed the envelope with a satisfied nod, knowing the inspector would act swiftly but quietly dot as she posted. The letter she glanced across the village green, where Vane was chatting with a group of farmers, his laughter carrying on the breeze. He was still confident, still playing his part. But Miss Marple knew that confidence was a fragile thing in a place like St. Mary Mead, where trust could turn to suspicion in a heartbeat. Her gambit had set the stage. Now it was only a matter of time before Vane's allies began to falter, and his carefully woven web began to fray. She returned to her cottage, her step light. The game was far from over, but she had made her move, and in St. Mary Mead, where every whisper carried weight, that was enough for now. Chapter 9. The London Connection. The train to London rattled along, its rhythmic clatter a soothing backdrop to Miss Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp eyes occasionally darting from the passing countryside to the other passengers in the compartment. A young couple whispered excitedly about their city plans, while an older gentleman buried his nose in a newspaper, muttering about stock prices. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. People, she mused, were so predictable in their distractions, yet so revealing in their unguarded moments. She was no stranger to London, though her visits were rare. The city's bustle, its smoky air and crowded streets, contrasted sharply with the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Yet today the metropolis held a particular allure. It was the next step in unraveling the enigma of Mr. Clarence Vane. Her satchel, tucked securely beside her, contained a slim notebook filled with meticulous observations about the charming swindler. The discrepancies in his backstory, uncovered during her discreet inquiries in Chapter 4, had pointed her here to the heart of England's capital, where secrets often hid in plain sight. Miss Marple had arranged to meet Inspector Harold Finch, an old acquaintance from her nephew Raymond's days in the police force. Harold was a methodical man, not prone to leaps of intuition, but he respected Miss Marple's knack for seeing what others missed. Their meeting was set for a discreet tea shop near Covent Garden, a place where the clink of teacups and the hum of conversation would mask their discussion. She adjusted her hat, a practical yet elegant affair, and prepared herself for the day's work. The tea shop, the Silver Spoon, was tucked between a florist and a bookbinder's. Its windows steamed from the warmth within. Miss Marple stepped inside, greeted by the scent of freshly baked scones and the faint tang of bergamot from brewing Earl Grey. Inspector Finch was already seated at a corner table, his broad frame slightly hunched over a cup of tea. His face, lined from years of chasing criminals, softened as he spotted her. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with a polite nod, "you're as punctual as ever. I trust the journey was pleasant?" "Quite tolerable, Harold," she replied, settling into the chair opposite him, "though I find trains these days are more crowded than they used to be." Now, tell me, have you had any luck with the name I sent you?" Finch's eyes narrowed slightly, a sign he was shifting into professional. "Mode. Clarence Vane, or whatever he's calling himself now. I've done some digging, as you asked. It wasn't easy fellow slippery as an eel, but I've got something." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting abandoned in her lap. "Do go on." Finch produced a small notebook, flipping it open to a page marked with precise handwriting. Vane's name popped up in connection with the Gentlemen's Club in Mayfair Westons, to be exact. Not the sort of place you'd expect a village charmer to frequent, but there's a pattern. Weston's is a hub for men with money and ambition, and not all of them are, shall we say, scrupulous. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A gentleman's club. How very interesting. And what did you find about Mr. Vane's activities there?" "He's been seen with a man named Victor Langley. Langley's a financier, or so he claims. Runs a small outfit called Langley and Sons, though there's no record of any sons. The firm's known for high-risk investments, some say too high. There have been whispers of fraud, but nothing stuck. Langley's clever, covers his tracks well." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the implications. "And Mr. Vane is associating with this Langley. Do you suppose he's a partner, or merely a pawn?" Finch sipped his tea, considering. "Hard to say. Vane's got charm, no question, but Langley's the sort who doesn't trust easily. If they're working together, Vane's likely the front man winning trust, drawing in the marks. Langley's the brains, handling the money." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles moving almost of their own accord. "A front man," she murmured. "Yes, that fits. Mr. Vane has a gift for making people feel special. You know, I saw it at the church fundraiser in St. Mary Mead, how he flattered Mrs. Pennington into nearly handing over her savings. If he's working for someone like Langley, they're a dangerous pair." Finch leaned back, his expression grim. "There's more. Langley's been linked to a string of failed ventures estates, shipping companies, even a railway scheme. Investors lose their shirts, but Langley always walks away clean. If Vane's his man in the field, they could be targeting your village for something bigger than a few pilfered heirlooms." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "I suspected as much. The charity auction in St. Mary Mead was too smooth, too perfect. No crime was committed, but it felt like a rehearsal. I believe Mr. Vane is building trust for a larger scheme, perhaps an estate swindle, or something tied to the village's wealthier families." Finch raised an eyebrow. "You've got evidence?" "Not enough for a courtroom," she admitted, "but enough to keep digging. The irregularities in the charity's books, the forged documents at his investment pitch, they all point to something deliberate. I need to know more about Langley. Can you get me into Weston's?" Finch nearly choked on his tea. "Weston's? It's men only, Miss Marple, and not exactly welcoming to outsiders. Even I'd have a hard time getting in without a member's invitation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh, I don't intend to stroll in myself, but I have a plan. You mentioned your nephew, Peter, works as a clerk in the city. Is he still at that accounting firm near Mayfair?" Finch frowned, catching her drift. "He is, but I don't like where this is going. Peter's a good lad, but he's no detective." "Nor am I, officially," Miss Marple said with a smile. But I find that young people, with their energy and their inconspicuousness, can be remarkably useful. If Peter could secure an invitation to Weston's, perhaps as a guest of a client, he might overhear something about Langley or Vane. Finch hesitated, then sighed. I'll talk to him. But you're playing a dangerous game, Miss Marple. Langley's not the sort to take kindly to being watched. Danger, she said lightly, is often overstated. I'll be careful, Harold. Now, shall we have another pot of tea? I've a feeling this day is far from over. By late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in Mayfair, strolling past the imposing facade of Weston's Gentlemen's Club. Its stone exterior, adorned with ivy, exuded old money and older secrets. She didn't linger too conspicuous, even for an unassuming elderly lady, but she noted the polished brass sign and the discreet doorman who scrutinized every passer-by. Peter Finch, the inspector's nephew, had agreed to help, albeit nervously. He was due to attend a meeting at the club that evening, posing as a junior accountant, accompanying a client. Miss Marple had coached him carefully. Listen, observe, but don't ask too many questions. People, she told him, reveal more when they think no one's paying attention. While Peter infiltrated Weston's, Miss Marple had another task. She'd learned from Finch that Langley and Sons had an office nearby, a modest suite in a building that housed several small firms. She decided to pay it a visit, not as a detective, but as a potential client, a role she'd played before with surprising success. The office was on the 3rd floor, reachable by a creaky lift that smelled faintly of polish and tobacco. The receptionist, a young woman with tightly pinned hair, looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Good afternoon, madam. May I help you?" Miss Marple smiled warmly, adjusting her gloves. "I hope so, my dear. I am Mrs. Jane Maple, spelled with one P. You know, it's often confused. I've heard Mr. Langley offers excellent investment opportunities, and I've a small sum I'd like to put to good use. Is he available?" The receptionist hesitated, her eyes flickering to a closed door at the back. "Mr. Langley's quite busy today, Mrs. Maple, but I can arrange an appointment. May I ask who recommended you?" "Oh, a charming gentleman in my village," Miss Marple said vaguely. "Mr. Clarence Vane. He spoke so highly of Mr. Langley's expertise." The receptionist's smile tightened, a subtle shift Miss Marple noted with interest. "Mr. Vane, yes. Well, let me check Mr. Langley's schedule." She rose and disappeared through the door, leaving Miss Marple alone in the waiting area. The room was sparsely furnished. A few chairs, a table with outdated magazines, and a framed certificate on the wall. Miss Marple stepped closer to examine it. It proclaimed Victor Langley a member of the Chartered Institute of Financiers, dated 5 years prior. The ink looked oddly fresh, and the frame was slightly askew, as if recently hung. Her fingers itched to investigate further, but the receptionist returned. "Mr. Langley can see you briefly," she said. "This way, please." Miss Marple followed, her heart quickening. The office beyond was small but opulent, with dark wood paneling and a desk cluttered with papers. Victor Langley stood to greet her, a tall man with sharp features and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His suit was impeccably tailored, but Miss Marple noticed a faint ink stain on his cuff, a small imperfection that spoke of haste. "Mrs. Maple," he said, gesturing to a chair, "a pleasure. I understand you're interested in our investment. Opportunities?" "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair with a deliberate air of frailty. "I'm a widow, you see, and I've a modest inheritance I'd like to grow. Mr. Vane assured me you're the man to trust." Langley's smile flickered, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward a stack of folders on his desk. "Vane's a good man," he said smoothly. "We've worked together on several ventures. What sort of investment are you considering?" Miss Marple launched into a carefully crafted tale of her fictional finances, peppering her story with just enough naivety to keep Langley interested. As she spoke, she watched his reactions, noting how his fingers tapped the desk when she mentioned large sums, how his eyes darted to the door when she referenced Vane. He was cautious, but not cautious enough. "I'll have my associate prepare some proposals," Langley said at last, rising to signal the end of the meeting. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Maple." "Thank you, Mr. Langley," Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. "I do hope we can work together. Mr. Vane's recommendation was so glowing." As she left the office, she felt a quiet thrill. Langley's guarded demeanor confirmed her suspicions. He and Vane were linked, and the connection was no casual acquaintance. But she needed more, something concrete to tie them to a crime. That evening, Miss Marple met Peter Finch at a quiet pub near King's Cross. The young man was flushed with excitement, his tie slightly askew. "I did it, Miss Marple," he whispered, sliding into the booth across from her. "I got into Weston's. It wasn't easy, those fellows are snooty as anything, but I kept my ears open, like you said. And—" She prompted, her voice calm but eager. "I overheard Langley talking to another man not Vane, someone older with a limp. They were in a corner, thought no one was listening. Langley mentioned a village job and said it was nearly ready. The other man asked about risks, and Langley laughed, said their front man had the locals eating out of his hand." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "A village job. Did they mention St. Mary Mead?" "Not by name," Peter admitted, "but they talked about an estate deal, something about a manor house. Langley said the paperwork was almost done, and they'd clear a fortune once the old biddies signed." Miss Marple's lips tightened. "Old biddies, indeed. Did you catch the other man's name?" "Only a first name, Reginald. I couldn't get closer without looking suspicious. But there's more. I saw Vane arrive just as I was leaving. He didn't see me, but he went straight to Langley's table. They looked cozy." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "You've done splendidly, Peter. This confirms what I suspected. Mr. Vane is not working alone, and this estate deal sounds like the culmination of his efforts in St. Mary Mead. We must act quickly." Peter looked nervous. "What's next?" "Should I go back to Weston's?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You've taken enough risks for one day. I'll need to speak with Inspector Finch again. We may need to set a trap, but first I want to know more about this Reginald." The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the Silver Spoon, where Inspector Finch awaited her. She relayed Peter's findings, watching his expression darken. "Reginald," Finch muttered, flipping through his notebook. "Could be Reginald Carver. He's a known associate of Langley's, small-time swindler. Specializes in forged documents. If he's involved, this estate deal could be a forgery scam. They might be planning to sell a property they don't own. Miss Marple nodded. That fits with the irregularities I've found in the charities books and the forged documents at Vane's investment pitch. They're building towards something big, perhaps targeting Lady Harrington's manor or another estate in St. Mary Mead. Finch rubbed his chin. We could raid Langley's office, but we'd need solid evidence. A forged deed, or a witness willing to talk? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. Then we must give them an opportunity to slip. I have an idea, Harold, but it will require some finesse. Can you arrange for a discreet watch on Langley's office? And perhaps a word with your contacts at the land registry. Finch grinned, catching her enthusiasm. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. I'll get it done. But what's your plan? She smiled, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. Let's just say I intend to make Mr. Langley feel a little too confident. People, you know, are so predictable when they think they've won. The next evening, Miss Marple orchestrated a small performance. She sent a letter to Langley's office, signed as Mrs. Maple, expressing enthusiasm for a significant investment in a property deal Vane had mentioned. She hinted at a substantial sum, enough to tempt even a cautious man like Langley. To ensure the letter reached him, she enlisted Peter to deliver it personally, posing as a courier. Meanwhile, she visited a contact of her own, a retired solicitor named Mr. Percival, who had once helped her nephew with a legal matter. Percival, now living in London, had connections at the land registry and a keen memory for shady dealings. Over tea in his cluttered study, Miss Marple shared her suspicions. Langley and Sons, Percival mused, adjusting his spectacles. I've heard the name. They were involved in a dubious sale in Kent a few years back, nothing proven. But the buyer lost everything. If they're targeting an estate, they'll need a convincing deed. I can check the registry for recent filings. And St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple smiled. That would be most helpful, Mr. Percival. And if you happen to hear of a Reginald Carver, do let me know. 2 days later, the pieces began to fall into place. Percival sent word of a suspicious deed. FILED for property near St. Mary Mead, a manor house owned by a distant cousin of Lady Harrington's, recently deceased. The deed named a shell company linked to Langley and Sons. At the same time, Finch reported that his watch on Langley's office had caught Vane visiting late at night, carrying a briefcase that looked heavy with documents. Miss Marple, now back, in her hotel room, reviewed her notes. The evidence was mounting, but it wasn't enough for an arrest, not yet. She needed to catch Langley or Vane in the act, or better yet, force a confession. Her thoughts turned to Weston's Gentlemen's Club, where Peter's eavesdropping had proven so fruitful. A bold idea formed, one that would require all her cunning. She contacted Finch with a request. Arrange for a high-profile client to visit Weston's, someone whose presence would unsettle Langley. Finch, skeptical but trusting, reached out to a retired judge he knew, a member of the club who owed him a favor. The judge agreed to host a small gathering at Weston's, with Peter again posing as an assistant to blend in. The night of the gathering was thick with fog, the gaslights of Mayfair casting eerie halos. Miss Marple, stationed in a hired car across the street, watched as finely dressed men entered Weston's. Peter, looking more confident than before, slipped inside with the judge's entourage. Miss Marple had given him a specific task, mentioned Mrs. Maple's investment in passing, loud enough for Langley or his associates to overhear. Inside, the club was a labyrinth of leather armchairs, cigar smoke, and hushed deals. Peter, clutching a glass of soda water to blend in, navigated the room with care. He spotted Langley at a corner table, deep in conversation with the man Peter had described as Reginald. Vane was nowhere in sight, but the tension in Langley's posture suggested he was on edge. Peter waited for the right moment. As the judge discussed a recent case with another member, Peter leaned in, feigning a casual remark. "Oh, by the way, sir, I heard Mrs. Maple's putting a fortune into that St. Mary Mead property deal. Quite the opportunity, from what Mr. Vane says." Langley's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Peter pretended not to notice, turning back to the judge, but the seed was planted. Langley excused himself and stepped into a side room where Peter glimpsed him speaking urgently to Reginald. Minutes later, chaos erupted. Reginald, flustered and clearly rattled, stood abruptly, knocking over a glass. "It's too soon," he hissed loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "If that Maple woman's already in, we need to move now." Langley grabbed his arm, trying to hush him, but the damage was done. The judge, ever observant, raised an eyebrow and signaled to a waiter. Peter, heart pounding, slipped out to report to Miss Marple. Outside, Miss Marple listened to Peter's account with a satisfied nod. "Well done, Peter. You've stirred the hornet's nest. Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. An hour later, Finch's men, stationed near Langley's office, reported suspicious activity. Vane had arrived, and the two men were seen burning documents in a small courtyard behind the building. Finch moved in, catching them with fragments of a forged deed and a ledger detailing payments from St. Mary Mead investors by dawn. Reginald Carver had cracked under questioning, confessing to his role in forging documents for Langley's schemes. He named Vane as the man who recruited investors in St. Mary Mead under Langley's orders. Langley, however, remained tight-lipped, and Vane was still at large, having slipped away during the raid. Miss Marple, back in her hotel, sipped a cup of tea as Finch updated her. "Carver's confession is a start," he said, "but without Vane, it's not enough to bury Langley. He's got lawyers who'll twist this into nothing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then we must find Mr. Vane. He's the key, Harold. And I suspect he'll return to St. Mary Mead. He thinks he's safe there. You see, thinks the village is still under his spell." Finch shook his head, half in admiration, half in exasperation. "You're going back, aren't you?" "Of course," she said, folding her knitting neatly into her satchel. "The game isn't over yet, but I'm satisfied with today's work. We've rattled them, Harold, and rattled men make mistakes." As the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out at the darkening countryside, her mind already plotting the next move. Vane was slippery, but he wasn't invincible. The London connection had given her the leverage she needed, and now, with the village's trust in her growing, she felt ready to spring the final trap. The manor house scheme was clearer now, its outlines sharp in her mind. She closed her eyes, picturing the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, and smiled. Justice, she thought, was a patient hunter. Chapter 10. The false confession. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths and thatched rooftops. The village buzzed with the kind of restless energy that follows a scandal narrowly averted. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest parlor, remained unruffled. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the distant hum of gossip filtering through her open window. The village was still reeling from the revelations about Clarence Vane, the charming newcomer whose silver tongue had nearly swindled half the gentry. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe the storm had passed. Vane was a trickster, and tricksters, she mused, never exit the stage without a final flourish. The morning had brought news of Vane's latest move, a public gathering at the village hall, scheduled for that very evening. According to Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose knack for overhearing conversations rivaled Miss Marple's own, Vane had promised a full explanation of the misunderstandings surrounding his investment schemes. The announcement had spread like wildfire, igniting curiosity and suspicion in equal measure. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she set her knitting aside. A public apology from a man like Vane? It was as plausible as a fox guarding a henhouse dot. She rose, smoothing her lavender cardigan, and glanced at the clock. There was time before the meeting to visit her old friend, Mrs. Clara Bantry, whose sharp wit and sharper tongue often proved useful in gauging the village's mood. As Miss Marple stepped into the warm afternoon, her mind churned with possibilities. Vane's apology was no act of contrition. It was a performance, and she intended to be in the front row to spot the sleight of hand. Mrs. Bantry's garden was a riot of color, roses and dahlias competing for attention under the watchful eye of her gardener, Tom. Clara herself sat on the veranda, a glass of lemonade in hand, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation as Miss Marple approached. "Jane, you're positively glowing with purpose," Clara remarked, gesturing to a wicker chair. "I assume this is about that Vane fellow and his theatrical mea culpa tonight?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she sat. "You've heard, then. What's the village saying?" Clara snorted. "Oh, the usual. Half think he's a misunderstood saint. The other half want him tarred and feathered. Mrs. Price swears he's planning to donate his entire fortune to the church to make amends. Can you imagine?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, her mind already sifting through the implications. A grand gesture to win hearts. But a man like Mr. Vane doesn't part with money unless it serves a purpose. Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "You think he's up to something, don't you? I saw him at the grocer's yesterday, all smiles and handshakes. He bought old Mr. Grayson's loyalty with a tin of imported biscuits. Biscuits, Jane. The man's shameless." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a memory of her nephew Raymond, who once described a con artist he'd encountered in London. "They charm you until you're blind," he'd said, "and by then your wallet's gone." Vane's charm was his weapon, and this apology was likely a feint to disarm the village's growing wariness. She needed to see him in action, to catch the flicker of deceit in his eyes. "I'll be at the hall tonight," Miss Marple said, rising, "and I suspect Mr. Vane will give us quite a show." The village hall was a modest affair, its wooden beams festooned with faded bunting from last month's fete. By 7 o'clock it was packed the air thick with the scent of lavender water and anticipation. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, choosing a seat near the back where she could observe without drawing attention. The crowd was a cross-section of St. Mary Mead, the vicar, Mr. Clement, looking faintly anxious, Lady Harrington, her brooch incident still a sore point, and young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, who'd come for the spectacle. Whispers rippled through the room as Clarence Vane took the stage, his tailored suit impeccable. His smile was study and practiced humility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vane began, his voice smooth as velvet, "I stand before you with a heavy heart. There have been misunderstandings, grievous ones, about my intentions in this fine village. I wish to set the record straight." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. His posture was too relaxed, his gestures too rehearsed. She glanced at the crowd, noting how Mrs. Grayson, the grocer's wife, leaned forward, her skepticism softened by his tone. Vane was playing to the room, and he was good. He spoke of his investment scheme, calling it an honest mistake born of enthusiasm. He admitted to errors in judgment, his voice catching just enough to suggest sincerity. "I have caused doubt where I sought trust," he said, "and for that I am deeply sorry. To prove my commitment to St. Mary Mead, I have decided to fund the restoration of the village clock tower, a gift to you all." A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. The clock tower, a crumbling relic, had been a point of contention for years. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. A generous offer, but too convenient. She caught Mr. Clement's eye. He looked torn between gratitude and unease. Vane's promise was a masterstroke, designed to shift suspicion to admiration. But promises cost nothing, and Miss Marple suspected this one would never materialize. As Vane continued, fielding questions with deft charm, Miss Marple's attention drifted to a man in the front row. He was unfamiliar, his sharp features and city suit out of place among the tweeds and cottons of St. Mary Mead. He clapped a little too enthusiastically at Vane's answers, his eyes darting to gauge the crowd's reaction. An accomplice, she thought, or perhaps a handler. Her mind flashed to the London financier she'd uncovered in the previous chapter, a shadowy figure linked to Vane's schemes. Was this man the connection? The meeting ended with applause, though Miss Marple noted it was less fervent than Vane might have hoped. As the crowd dispersed, she lingered, watching Vane shake hands with the vicar. The city man slipped out a side door, and Miss Marple made a mental note to follow up. She approached Mr. Clement, who was mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "A stirring speech," she said lightly. "What did you make of it, vicar?" Mr. Clement sighed. "He says all the right things, Miss Marple, but I can't shake the feeling he's playing us for fools." "That clock tower business, do you think he means it?" "I think," she replied, choosing her words carefully, "that Mr. Vane is a man who promises the moon, but delivers shadows. We must keep our eyes open." That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the table. Her notebook lay open, filled with neat observations about Vane's speech, the pause before his apology, the way he avoided direct answers, the stranger in the front row. She was certain the apology was a diversion, but for what? Vane's schemes had grown bolder. First the charity auction, then the investment pitch, now this public spectacle. Each move was calculated to restore trust, to buy time. But time for what? The answer came the next morning, courtesy of young Tommy Pierce, who arrived at her cottage with a breathless report. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess. Mr. Vane's been meeting with Mr. Grayson and some others at the Red Lion. They're talking about a new land deal, something about buying up the old mill for a fancy hotel." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The old mill, a derelict structure on the edge of the village, had been the subject of speculation for years. Its owner, old Mr. Harrow, was frail and easily swayed. A hotel scheme was precisely the kind of grand, glittering promise Vane would dangle to lure investors. And with his apology fresh in their minds, the village elite might be just gullible enough to bite. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, slipping him a shilling. "Keep your ears open, won't you?" As Tommy scampered off, Miss Marple considered. Her next move, confronting Vane directly, would be pointless. He'd slip through her fingers like quicksilver. No, she needed to undermine his credibility, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow before he could close his deal. The village was a small world, and in small worlds, gossip was a powerful weapon. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple set her plan in motion with the precision of a chess grandmaster. She began at the post office, where Mrs. Price was sorting letters with her usual zeal. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but deliberate. "I hear Mr. Vane's planning a hotel at the old mill. Quite ambitious, don't you think? Though I wonder if he's checked the land's title properly. My nephew Raymond once knew a man who lost everything on a bad deed." Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "A bad deed? Well, I never. I'll have to tell Mrs. Grayson. She's been going on about that hotel scheme all morning." From there, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where she mentioned, almost in passing, a story she'd read about a conman who used public apologies to mask fraudulent land deals. Mr. Clement, already uneasy, promised to warn Mr. Harrow. By tea-time she'd planted similar doubts. With Lady Harrington and the local baker, each conversation a delicate nudge rather than a push. The village, she knew, would do the rest. By the 3rd day, the whispers had taken root. At the Red Lion, Miss Marple overheard Mr. Grayson muttering about shady dealings and too good to be true. Vane, meanwhile, seemed oblivious, his confidence unshaken as he met with potential investors in the pub's back room. Miss Marple, sipping a lemonade in the corner, watched him work the room, his laughter too loud, his gestures too expansive. He was overplaying his hand, she thought, and that was her opening. She approached Mr. Harrow, who sat alone nursing a pint. "Mr. Harrow," she said gently, "I hope you're not rushing into this mill business. Land deals are so tricky, aren't they? My late cousin's husband once lost a fortune because the seller's papers weren't in order." Mr. Harrow blinked, his weathered face creasing with worry. "You don't say, Miss Marple. Vane's got all sorts of documents, but, well, maybe I ought to have a solicitor look at them." "A wise decision," she said, patting his arm. "Better safe than sorry." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Lady Harrington's manor, where the mill deal was the talk of the room. Vane was there, all charm and reassurances, but the mood had shifted. Mrs. Grayson asked pointed questions about the mill's valuation, and Mr. Clement mentioned a solicitor's review. Vane's smile faltered, just for a moment, and Miss Marple caught it. She sipped her tea, satisfied that her subtle campaign was bearing fruit. As the evening wore on, she slipped into the manor's library, where she found Tommy Pierce delivering a tray of scones. "Tommy," she whispered, "did you see that city man at the hall the other night? The one in the sharp suit?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "Aye, Miss Marple. He's been at the Red Lion, too. Heard him talking to Vane about cleaning up the books before the deal closes." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The city man was the key. She was sure of it. If he was tied to the London financier, as she suspected, his presence meant Vane's scheme was nearing its climax. She thanked Tommy and returned to the drawing-room, her mind racing. She needed to act quickly, to turn the village's skepticism into action before Vane could seal the deal. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Inspector Craddock, her trusted contact from Scotland Yard, who was staying in nearby Much, Benham. Over tea, she shared her suspicions about Vane's hotel scheme and the mysterious city man. "I believe, Inspector," she said, "that Mr. Vane is planning to sell the mill using forged documents, with this accomplice ensuring the financial trail is covered. If we can expose the forgery before the sale, we might catch him in the act." Craddock, who had long since learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts, nodded. "I'll have my men look into the mill's title and this city fellow's background. But, Jane, you're playing a dangerous game. If Vane suspects you're on to him, he might turn nasty." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm only an old lady with a fondness for gossip, Inspector. Who could possibly see me as a threat?" Craddock chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "I'll have a plainclothes man keep an eye on your cottage, just in case." The following days were a whirlwind of subtle maneuvers. Miss Marple enlisted Mrs. Bantry to host a tea party, inviting key villagers, including Mr. Harrow and Mrs. Grayson. Over scones and clotted cream, she steered the conversation toward land fraud, recounting a fictional tale of a village swindled by a charming outsider. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and by the time the party ended, Mr. Harrow had resolved to delay the mill sale until a solicitor could verify the documents. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock's inquiries bore fruit. The city man, identified as a Mr. Leonard Fisk, had a history of financial fraud in London, with ties to the same network Miss Marple had uncovered in Chapter 9. The mill's title, Craddock reported, showed signs of tampering, though Vane's forgeries were clever enough to fool a casual glance. Armed with this, Miss Marple knew the time was ripe to force Vane's hand. She arranged for a public meeting at the village hall, ostensibly to discuss the clock tower restoration. In reality, it was a trap. She asked Mr. Clement to invite Vane, framing it as a chance to solidify his goodwill. She also ensured Mr. Harrow brought his solicitor, a sharp-eyed young man named Mr. Tate, who had reviewed the mill's documents and found discrepancies. As the meeting began, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, watching Vane take the stage once more. He spoke eloquently about the clock tower, but the crowd was restless, their trust eroded by days of whispered doubts. When Mr. Tate stood to ask about the mill deal, citing concerns about the title, Vane's composure cracked. His answers grew evasive. His charm strained. Miss Marple seized the moment. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice clear and unassuming, "I'm sure you've checked the mill's ownership thoroughly. But perhaps Mr. Tate could share his findings, for everyone's peace of mind." The room fell silent. Vane's eyes darted to Fisk, who was seated near the door, his face pale, Mr. Tate outlined the irregularities, dates that didn't align, signatures that seemed forged. The crowd murmured, and Vane's smile vanished. He stammered a response, claiming a clerical error, but the damage was done. Mr. Harrow stood, declaring the mill deal off till a full investigation could be conducted. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Miss Marple slipped out, her heart light with satisfaction. Vane's credibility was in tatters, his scheme unraveling before it could take root. She glanced at Fisk, who was hurrying away, and made a mental note to pass his description to Craddock. The game wasn't over, but she had won this round. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her notebook open once more. The village was abuzz with talk of Vane's downfall, but she knew he wasn't finished. A man like him would have a contingency, a final ploy to salvage his plans. She sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the hidden ledger she'd discovered in Chapter 11. If Vane was desperate, he might make a mistake, and she would be ready. For now, though, she was content. The village was waking up, their skepticism a shield against Vane's charms. She had turned his false confession against him, using his own performance to expose his deceit. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple smiled to herself. St. Mary Mead was safe for one more day.